Okay, the Oregon Education Investment Board will come to order. We have a few people on the phone. We'll have Seth go ahead and call it.
Governor Kitzhaber.
Here.
Julia Brim Edwards.
Present.
Yvonne Curtis. Matthew Donegan. Samuel Henry. Nicole June Maher.
Here.
Mark Mulvihill.
Here.
David Reeves. Ron Saxton. Mary Spilby.
Here.
Kay Turan. Hannah Vandering. Dick Whitnell. Here.
Okay, did you call Mrs. Donegan? Yvonne Curtis?
She is not.
She's not. Okay, she was planning to call in, so we don't actually have a quorum yet, but I think we'll go ahead.
We need one, yeah.
Yeah, okay, very good. I understand that Hannah's on her way. So let's start with approval of minutes of the January board meeting. You have a motion?
So moved.
Yeah, excuse me. Wait, sorry, we can't. We have not a quorum. What am I talking about? Well, let me, I'd like to just take a minute before we jump into the agenda and reflect on the importance of the content of what we're going to be dealing with today. Over the last 2 weeks, we've received new information about Oregon students that I think can help us sort of put our work into perspective. 2 weeks ago, we received the analysis of the readiness for school of our incoming kindergarten class. 95% of those students participated in that. And the data gives us some unprecedented and really sobering look at readiness for school of Oregon's youngest learners. As you know, this information will be used by schools, by districts, by early learning hubs, by providers of early learning services to focus resources and improve the programs on where it will do us the most good. And the results, I think, are really a startling look at the state of early childhood development in Oregon. 33% of the students could only name one of five or fewer letters, and 14% of the alphabet, and 14% of the students couldn't name any. Communities of color were lower than average in early math and in literacy measures. So I think these results validate a couple of things. They validate our focus on trying to reframe our system of early learning, our historically sort of scattershot approach to early learning in Oregon, and it will help guide our efforts in early learning and the importance of being accountable for outcomes. It also validates a recognition that in order to address the achievement gap, we've got to start very early in our work. Last week, the Department of Education put out the Oregon graduation rate report that showed that a 4-year graduation rate over the last 5 years is actually up slightly. But within English language learners, the economically disadvantaged, Latinos, and Native Americans, it hasn't, for all practical purposes, just stagnated. And that means that if we're going to reach our 40-40-20 goals, we've got to get better results quickly, and particularly within those groups where progress is actually stagnated. So as we focus our attention now, as we go into a new budget cycle on funding and the budget process, I think it's very, very important that we try to have a data-driven set of decisions as we approach the 15-17 budget. And I think we need to be committed to developing a budget framework that rewards innovation and also rewards those programs that are actually proven to improve student success. So as we move forward and have this discussion of outcomes-based budgeting, I want to encourage all of us to think about how our budget decisions are actually going to impact the current needs of those students that are struggling the most, right? I think all of us have grown from and learned from the implementation of the OEIB equity lens. I want to encourage us to actually take those lessons and apply them now in a very practical way. I think we have an opportunity here to really walk our talk. We have the opportunity to take the equity lens based on this information, which I think validates what a lot of us already suspected, and turn the equity lens from a policy written down on a piece of paper to an investment tool that can drive equity in budgeting and equity in outcomes. And, it would be very troubling to me if, in light of this data, in light of our 40-40-20 goals, and recognition that if we don't move the dial with those groups, we're not going to get there, to build a budget and a set of budget recommendations that wasn't informed by the information that we have received over the last couple of weeks. So, Nancy, to you.
Thank you. I want to begin by an introduction of a new member to the Oregon Education Investment Board, and that is David Martinez. So if you want to stand up and...
Welcome.
What I want to tell you a little bit about David that we're just thrilled about is, first of all, he is a first-generation high school graduate, first-generation college graduate for his family, so he knows the importance of the dream of education, that everyone has access to a quality education and post-secondary education. In addition to that, he's from rural Oregon, and we just think that is great because we know it's really important to keep our rural communities in mind along with all our other communities as we think through how to achieve the 40-40-20 dream. So he comes to us from Portland Community College, where he's been working with underrepresented youth to make sure they can get to college and go to college. And when we were at the summit, the higher ed summit, probably 15 people came up to me and said, "You are so lucky that you have David Martinez." So we're very excited about what he adds to the team. So great to have you, David. What I want to talk about really reinforces what the governor just said. So if you take out this pamphlet for the board members and people around the table, it's tab 2. And if you're in the audience, there are some over there. And this is a draft. It was put together for the superintendent's conference, which was at Shalashan 2 weeks ago. So we considered to have more feedback about it. But I want to start by talking about the pathway on the front page, because I think there's something very important to emphasize here. You'll see at the bottom of the pathway, it talks about collective responsibility. One of the experiences I've had is everybody is talking about, if you want me to do that target, then you need to give me more money, more investment. And I just want to remind everyone that the pathway is a handshake. It's a handshake that says we're all responsible for these targets. The majority of these targets were chosen because the research says if your students move successfully to these targets or outcomes, their chances of meeting the 40-40-20 goals are increased. So this is going to take using all the resources that go out to you in combination of any strategic investment. So, and then if you go inside, there are 4 major things that we're really focused on. The first is what we're calling from surviving to thriving. This aligns with what the governor and First Lady talk about when they say poverty to prosperity. This is really acknowledging that about 50% of our students do live in poverty, and that as a community, working in combination with our CCOs, community care organizations, our regional collaboratives, our hubs, we need to make sure that we really provide the needs for our families in poverty. The second key focus we have is around education equity, and the governor spoke about this, prioritizing students in the opportunity gap and bringing the resources to them so that they can move themselves out of the gap. The third thing is reading changes the game, and this is really working from age 3 to grade 3. We know literacy, early literacy even starts before age 3, but before that we're really focused on healthcare and stable families. And OEIB is most about the transitions on each side, so we really want to make sure that we start working on those pre-literacy skills. So in the future, when students come to kindergarten, we are not going to see a figure of 33% of our students knowing 5 or less letters. So that's the third thing. And the last thing is, it says they're achieving the dream, but in the revision it will be realizing the dream. And what I say is if our students work hard and make great progress all along the pathway, it's our responsibility to help them realize the dream by making sure post-secondary education is accessible to them. So those are the 4 big things we're working on. Just so you know, some of the changes in this is going to be that we need to include more information about rural Oregon, STEM education, and then we want to make sure that this is aligned with all of the other initiatives from the governor. And so that's a little bit about some of the things that's bringing more focus to the work we're supposed to be doing, which is changing the dial on those outcomes. So this will be revised, and the next time we pass it out, it will be a new and improved copy. So that's
Any questions for Nancy?
Just
Yep.
since it's a draft, I like it. And I think it lays out some of the big pillars. I'm just curious that between, I like the foundation pieces of surviving and thriving, education equity, and then there's 2 focuses on the age 3 to 3rd grade, and then higher ed. It seems like there's sort of a missing imperative between 3rd grade and.
yeah.
So I'm sure there was a discussion about it, but interested in sort of what that missing piece is.
Yeah, so what they say is you kind of have to have some laser focus on a few things to really get going, and that's where we're going to work with our partners in K-12. Most of the things along the way are things that are going to happen during the K-12 years. So most school districts are putting in place models like response to intervention. So we'll be a partner in that. But we won't be as focused on those right now, but our partners will be.
Yeah, I guess I'm just concerned because this morning at the Equity and Partnership meeting, we had sort of presentation of all the dropout rates and the graduation rates, and there's some subgroups that are going down. I think actually the performance is worsening, and then the other ones that are going up are only just incrementally going up. Is that I wouldn't want to be thinking about how within our mandate we move the dial in that area. So it's there's a lot of space between a 9-year-old and a
Talking about
17-year-old.
the gap between 3rd grade reading and ready to go in 9th grade.
That ready to go 9th grade's not there. So I just see it goes from grade 3 to
Gotcha.
higher ed.
Yeah, this is a seamless pathway from high school to college and career. So we look at that as covering high school and college and career.
So,
But your point
so
is
maybe
well
it's
taken.
the subhead
Okay,
that's
got it.
right to higher ed.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. That's good feedback. Appreciate it.
I see this there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Has Yvonne Curtis, have you joined us? Okay, she was going to be giving us an update on the best practices in student transition subcommittee. So let's try to get to talk over to the next agenda item, which would be Rob Saxton talking about strategic investment implementation update. Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Nicole, then you're on the line. Can you give us an update on the equity and partnerships?
Yes, I can. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Greetings from I-84 on Route 610. So we had our meeting this morning, and Julia, I'm going to defer to you if I forget anything. I'm going to keep it brief. We're continuing to make progress on our out-of-school use policy. Today we had a deeper discussion about recommendations that we will bring forward in regards to the GED aspect of that policy. We've also invited the folks who have done all the research on improving the GED process to our next full OEIB issues, and certainly this is not just an equity issue. We also had a full briefing on the new dropout data and where there have been improvements and where there have not been improvements, as well as having a conversation about ensuring that the strategic investments that we're making have a positive impact on those populations, not just in a few areas, but across the board. And then we also had a presentation from the Youth Development Council. So it was very well put together and really reflected a lot of our equity investment efforts. So that's where we are today. And invite Julia if you have anything you want to add on behalf of the equity committee this weekend.
Any questions? Okay, thank you, Nicole.
Governor, outcomes and budget, or in the outcomes and investment subcommittee, we met on February 11th, and we were also visited by our chief education officer. And I don't know, Nancy, if you believe anybody reads these little things you put out on Friday, but I want to assure the OEIB board that if your name's in that thing that you put out on Fridays, that you are well read, because I got a number of phone calls on that because of the word outcomes in this committee that I'm on, along with Ron Saxon, Duncan Wise, and Pam Curtis, and Hannah Vanderling. I can remember the calls I received this last week on about outcomes because of all of the things the governor just reported to us, some of the downsides, but I can remember calling Dick Alexander and just whining and whimpering, Dick, get on the stick, you're involved in this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, Dick's gone and I'm here.
Did you give yourself a stern lecture?
Yeah, I did. But being a used car salesman, one's working on their reputation all the time. And, used car salesmen, along with politicians and prostitutes and evangelists, are all about in the same boat, according to USA Today. But, to be serious, I'm at the age where I'm not a resume builder anymore, but the reputation is important. And I think we need to reflect upon these, from the phone calls I got this last week, that we are in heavy-duty work here. And we need to come behind you, sir, Governor, and we need to have these outcomes be worthwhile and not just a bunch of yak and big hat, no cattle stuff. We need to get this thing handled, because time's a wasting, and I'm always impacted by what Dick always said in his comments, that 80% of the brain is developed in the first 36 months, and those are fast years. So we got an initiative, especially on the downside, on the early learning council side. So anyway, that's let me give you a brief report on what we discussed. There's 3 topics that we talked about in the process of recommending strategic investments in the upcoming budget cycle: development of accountability frameworks, and the OEIB scorecard. Talk very briefly about those 3. The Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee will essentially serve the same function as the governor's educating funding team from the previous budget cycle. As part of this function, the subcommittee will coordinate input from the other subcommittees, the Oregon Department of Education, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and other stakeholders. Ultimately, we will submit a budget brief in late spring, and we'll hear today more about this process from Whitney Grubbs. That's in item number 6. Also, we discussed the need to shore up the tight, loose, tight governance structure. As a business person, I think I was more tight than tight, loose, tight, but it does make sense. It means that we're tight on goals, loose on strategies, entrepreneurialism, if you want to call it that, for attaining them, and tight on support and, if necessary, intervention with results falling short. Dr. Golden informed us that she planned to craft a letter charging the Early Learning Council, the Oregon Department of Education, and the Higher Education Coordinating Commission with developing accountability frameworks. These frameworks are intended to clarify the supports and interventions the appropriate state agencies may employ under which conditions. The subcommittee provided Dr. Golden with some key principles to take into account when drafting her letter, which she plans to send out later this month. Lastly, we reviewed the OEIB scorecard, which will be presented to the board today for review and discussion. Our upcoming meeting will focus mostly on the budgeting process, and we look forward to working with our fellow board members and others in crafting our final recommendations. And to say in closing, I don't think we need to run from outcomes and investment. Those are 2 key words, and I don't know which one's more important than the other one, but we are going to keep score, and we're not talking about widgets here. As I said before, we're talking about individual lives, and I appreciate your shoulder behind the wheel on that, Governor, and we'll see what happens down the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions, comments? Do you have anything to add? Welcome.
Thank you.
Did Dick tell it right, or do you have any comments on
I
that?
think Dick got it right.
All right. Good. Okay, let me just check one more time. Is Dr. Curtis on the line?
So she was prepared at 1:15 and then got a message that said it was going to be at 4 o'clock. So she's in Boston, and I bet we've been trying everything to get a hold of her.
Okay,
So when she is back, it'll probably be around 4 o'clock our time.
okay. Very good. Okay, we have a quorum now. So could we need to approve the minutes from the January board meeting?
So moved.
Moved. Seconded by anybody?
Second.
Second. Is there a discussion on the minutes? If not, so ordered. And that brings us to item number 5. Rob Saxton.
Governor Kitzhauer, Chief Education Officer Goldman, members of the OEIB, Rob Saxton, Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction, and I'm joined by Sarah Pope, Chief Staff at the Oregon Department of Education. And we're going to talk a little bit about the strategic initiatives and the work that we've done with the strategic initiatives from the department, really since the bills 3232 and 3233 were signed into law in July. And in just a second, I think we'll have a presentation up here and we can talk about this. There were the two bills, 3232 and 3233, and I'd like to talk about this and go through some of these and keep it fairly high level and talk about sort of the basics of how we did this, and then make sure that we provide some opportunity for discussion between ourselves and question answering and members of the OEIB, so that I'm sure that there could be a number of questions. So the 4 areas of focus were early reading, ready for the world of work, college going, and then the support for teaching and learning. These developed into, over time, 33 separate initiatives, and there were 644 grant recipients of those 33 initiatives. We put together this map of the state of Oregon, which I think is a really good visual representation of where resources have gone out to date. And so not all the resources have currently been awarded. There are about $20 million still in existing resources that have not yet been awarded. But as it currently sits, every single school district and other education providers across the state received at least 2 of these grants. And so every single one of these is covered. And then you can see that there were some that received 3, some 4, and some districts received 5 or more grants. And this was a really important representation of that. And you can see that we have districts that received 5 or more grants clear out in the easternmost part of the state, western, northern, southern, and so forth, which I think is really important around geographic distribution of how this turned out. The dollars were targeted, of course, at the steps along the way of our continuum in education, so making sure that we have children arrive at kindergarten ready to learn, that they're readers by the end of 3rd grade, and all along the progression that we often talk about. And really involved a new effort at the department because we integrated this summer both the Early Learning Council and the Youth Development Division, and then we had an opportunity within these efforts to partner with some other organizations like the Arts Commission, state libraries, and Bureau of Labor and Industries. We have a number of lessons that have learned, and I think that this probably is a place where members of OEIB would like to engage in a conversation. Certainly, we would like to do that, and we can do that now as we move through the presentation. But one lesson that we learned for sure is that we started very quickly in the process of identifying what it was that we hoped to accomplish, putting out some of the requests for proposals, and then the timeline for those to come back and so on. What we found was that we were moving a little bit too quickly in a number of places, and so we slowed our timeline down just a little bit, especially around the time for folks to be able to respond to our RFPs. People needed a longer response window. And so we broadened that just a little bit, but beyond that, we've really stayed to our timeline. And there's a delicate balance here between making sure that we do this right and that we have an opportunity for people to respond, and getting these resources into the hands of providers so they can start to move the dial on outcomes for kids. We don't want to hold on to the money for too long and not begin to see good return. The other place where we got some feedback was that our small, remote, and rural school districts were not as prepared as some of our larger districts when it came to having grant writers and being able to really enter into this with the same level of competition, if you will, for these dollars. And so we were sure that we put some dollars in the hands of ESDs so that they could hire grant writers and provide support. And then we also did a little bit of a flow through to some of our small remote school districts.
Question? Yeah.
I have a question that, Governor, for example, Curry County, there was an article in the Oregonian about the district's child poverty epidemic, and it talked about particularly the Port Orford. Are you?
Port Orford Langlands?
Yeah.
Absolutely, right down here.
Yeah, exactly, on the left, on the bottom of the corner there. Well, you just said it, I guess, you purposely are looking at some of those that wouldn't have the skill set to ask for this money, but yet they're probably you could build on a T account that they need the money more than the one that had a skill set to ask for the money. So,
right.
Are we?
We have. And what we've attempted to do there is we wanted to make sure that we got some money into the hands of the ESDs. So each ESD got $15,000 so that they could either hire or contract with a grant writer to provide services to some of these small districts so that they could have grant writers help them with some of the responses. And then furthermore, we did a flow through to some of the smaller districts that looked different than we did with any other districts, especially in the areas of educator effectiveness and ramping up teaching to the Common Core. Because those were two areas that every district needed to be able to have some capacity. And so we had some flow through dollars that went to those districts. And really when I look at the map, there's a pretty good representation across the state of districts that were successful. Although when I look at Port Orford Langlands specifically, it looks like they received 2. And having visited that district in the last year or so and being born down in that country, I have a special sensitivity for folks down there in the South Coast.
On an economic sense,
This is Nicole. I have a question, if it's appropriate to ask now. And the question is, what percentage of the $65 million that's been expended thus far has gone to school districts, and what percentage has gone to community-based nonprofits?
To be honest, I don't know the answer at this point in time, but I'd be more than happy to get that answered and make sure that we send the information out to every member of the OEIB. But I cannot answer that at this point.
Governor, it's economically speaking, and if we were a business plan on getting a business return on investment and what have you, I think we would think one way, but maybe I'm just an underdog guy, but we've got to treat every kid, even if they're in a slow population area, exactly the same. And Rob, I know where your heart is, and you've exemplified that over and over again in all your areas. So just keep conscious of that, because we're not. This kid down here is just as important as the kid in my backyard. You know the whole story. But doggone it, we need to be that way, because the high tide will raise all boats.
Yeah, I think that really was what I was trying to get at in my opening comments.
Yeah.
That there are certain groups, particularly one of them obviously is kids who beat generational poverty, and that is very much reflected certainly in that part of the state as well as others. And as we make recommendations for the 15-17 budget cycle, I think we need to be very cognizant that we have an equity lens in place. Now we have to actually make it something meaningful. Nancy and then Ben.
Yeah, I think what this conversation is about is how do we scale up? Because some of these things are pilots so that we can try out some new innovations, but in the end, we have to have strategies that meet the needs of all of the kids, and we have to be working on that all along. So as we're piloting, we're also looking at the systemic changes that can become just a part of the architecture of all the school districts and communities.
Thank you. So in our thinking about,
Governor, at the risk of being parochial and at the even greater risk of stating the obvious, I think it's also important to note, and this is not to reflect on Rob in any way at all, but for this board to note that these investments are almost exclusively in the K-12 realm, and that this P20 board has, I think, as you've expressed, Governor, a real obligation to build that seamless system.
as we thought about this and how to look at it or think about it, we really got into 3 different places, and you'll see the 3 different ones represented in our presentation. One of them was that there were places where we felt like the resources need to be pretty broad because everyone needed to do it. So, for example, in educator effectiveness, everyone is under the same rules on Senate Bill 290, and we need to make sure that evaluation systems are well in place and thoughtfully implemented so that we're able to ensure that the outcomes of that will improve the practice of educators across the state. And or the implementation of Common Core, that there needed to be broad distribution because all teachers are responsible for those standards. And then there were other places where we wanted to go really deep, where we said, here, this is a place where there is a significant need, and we can invest significantly here and get a deeper penetration of the initiative, so that we can see the kinds of outcomes, and perhaps it's something that we want to replicate elsewhere. And so we looked at that in a couple of different ways. And some of them were also about replicating things that had been successful previously.
So, Governor Kitsap and members of the board, for the record, my name is Sarah Pope. I kind of feel like we should have put these lessons learned at the end so we could give you the baseline and then we could have the rich discussion. But we'll go through the rest of these, and then as people want to offer insights and discussion, let's take them as they come. So I'm just going to start where Rob left off. Number 3 on the importance of partnerships, but recognizing that they take time. We felt really strongly that if districts and nonprofits and entities had up to a maximum of 2 years to make progress with students, we wanted them to get the money as quickly as possible. And the balance is that in many places we are asking people to partner in ways that they hadn't partnered before. Like for the example of Eastern Promise, community colleges and universities working with school districts, with the example of STEM, private money being leveraged with state money, and just recognizing that those partnerships take time to form. So it was a balancing act more than anything. The 4th lesson learned, and there's a million more, but these were some of the highlights, is from leaders within communities of color, and specifically around the importance of wraparound services, that providing access is not the same as ensuring that all students have an equitable opportunity to succeed, right? And so that if kids need help with homework, if parents need parenting classes, if kids need places to sleep and do their homework when they get home, those needs need to be taken care of if we're going to see those children have an equitable opportunity to succeed in programs. 5th point is around the need for flexible
cycles. Can you just clarify what you mean there? I mean, I understand, at least in the healthcare sense, the difference between access and actually getting what you need to change the health outcome. Can you just describe that a little bit more, the difference you're trying to paint there?
Yeah, so for instance, around STEM programs, we have a real focus using the equity lens to ensure that historically underserved students are receiving programs through these strategic investments, so that a certain number...
Your point is that, just so I can get it in my mind, that you can give them access to programs, but they don't have the additional help.
Support, correct.
Support, okay.
We won't see the outcomes,
Yep.
right. The 5th piece is around the need for flexible cycles, and this is just going to be an ongoing challenge as we work in the year of the biennium, which funds programs for 2 years. Some of these programs, we're going to see the dial move really quickly. Some of the places that I would probably guess in that area would be 9th grade on track. You can see school districts and nonprofits put programs into place over the course of the summer. You can see more students within the end of that academic year on track to graduate by the end of their with enough credits in 9th grade to be on track to graduate. There's going to be other programs that just take longer, for example, dual language programs, right? And so we're balancing a 2-year funding cycle with different time horizons. The 6th is really a piece on focus, and I think maybe we could have an interesting discussion around this with the board. They started out as 2 bills. Before they got to the department, through the process of going through the OEIB and the legislature, we funded over 33 separate initiatives. So the money got pretty diffuse at times. So we are absolutely going to see outcomes, and the balance is, with more focus, what might that look like in future funding cycles. Just wanted to briefly highlight a couple of the ways that we led the communication to the field. Many of these are very common sense, but I wanted to call your attention to the technical assistance webinars. We were told that we're releasing a lot of different competitive grants, so we felt it was really important to give everybody opportunities to dial into at least 2 technical webinars for each RFP, so that someone, regardless of where they lived, what district they went to, what nonprofit they worked for, could get their questions answered as it relates to that RFP before applying. This is simply a screenshot of where you can find the one-stop shop for all information related to strategic investments.
I had a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's back on the lessons learned, and I just, I'm
you say focus, and I'm trying to understand, we have these initiatives. We also had the compact committees that were working on strategies and tactics to really help us get to where we want to go. And I'm wondering if there was any, did we use the information that came out of those compact committees about what they believed would be most helpful in us moving the dial for our students in each one of the districts, to apply for the grants and use that money as supplements to what I would hope they would be going through their local budget process to be able to invest in those strategies and tactics? Or was this outside of that? And how do we bring it all together where there is, this is what we're trying to do, and all of these outside grants and that are still getting us to the end goal of 40-40-20?
It's a really good question.
I guess what I would say is some. So my hope would be that districts that identified a specific need, like around third grade reading, for example, would really target the resources that are available in the reading initiative portion of this, and then our expectation as they applied for the grant was what kind of outcomes do you expect to get, and then in a number of the grants it was what kind of matching will there be in local dollars or other partnerships that come in to sort of leverage these dollars that are available.
And I guess my hope is there are some people who spend a whole lot of time really trying to look at student data and where that district in particular needed to go. And there was a lot of time and energy, and I think those were really good conversations. And I want to make sure that we're honoring that and that we give them the tools to be able to access grants like this and any opportunities that we have to help them. So
I think it's a really good point, and I think in future cycles we can ensure a really tight connection between the filling out of the achievement compacts and the setting of the goals, and then overlaying that with the sorts of strategic investments.
And the last thing I'll say is I really appreciate the idea of making sure that you give enough time for the partners to all commit, because I think sometimes a group will write a grant and then there's a small group of people and we're going to move this and we're going to do it. It doesn't have, you have to have the commitment of the whole community in order to make it happen. So go slow to go fast. Let's make sure we have the plan in place. Thank you.
Just the timeline, this is a chart that we put out a long time ago, and we're going to meet this timeline, and we just wanted to make sure that people know we're going to meet that timeline.
So just a quick overview, 3233, it was the bill that we're going to talk about first, and that's the focus on the network of quality teaching and learning. So providing supports for the educators in our system in order to see increase in student achievement.
This is just a shot of where we sit currently on the network for quality teaching and learning, and we have about, I think it's $5.15 million that are currently unallocated, and you can see on the right-hand column, the left-hand column is the various initiatives, and then on the far right-hand column, really where that currently stands. So if it's green, it means that those dollars have been allocated. If it says RFP, it is that we currently are awaiting responses. The RFP is out, we're awaiting responses. And then if it says in process, it's because we have the RFPs back and we're now reviewing those RFPs.
And then 3232 was directly focused on student success and closing achievement gaps more specifically. And in these four main areas, which is what Chief Education Officer Nancy Boland has been meeting with around kindergarten readiness, third grade proficiency, ninth grade progress towards graduation, high school completion, and college enrollment, ready for the global board.
And on this particular group, on 32, we have $13.4 million left, and you can see that fewer of these are completed and more RFPs are currently in the field. So one of the things that we did was release early, and the area where we released early was on the mentorship grant. Well, we didn't want to have the school year started, and we have a whole bunch of new educators in the state, and we won't have these mentor dollars, and we don't have mentors provided as early as possible for our new educators. 1,132 teachers in the state of Oregon have mentors this year because of this, the mentorship dollars that were available here, approximately $5 million. 135 new administrators also have mentors. 85% of the new teachers and administrators of applicant districts were able to be awarded mentors this year. We, in that award, school districts receive,
Yeah, just a quick question, I'm sorry. You said the number, 1,132 teachers.
yes,
What, do you know the total number of new teachers in the state?
I do not, but I know that it's, well, my recollection is around 1,800, but I don't have it precisely. But again, that is something that I can find out for you. And both the good and the bad with that, right, is the good is that we have a whole bunch of educators this year because of the new investment in dollars, and the bad is that this $5 million then became a little bit more diffuse in the way that we were able to allocate it. In fact, we had originally intended to award $5,000 per teacher per mentor, and we ended up moving that to $4,000 and $3,800 per beginning administrator. And so a little bit more diffuse than what it had been. In the awardees, you can see that there were some individual school districts that applied for these, like David Douglas or Portland Public or McMinnville. And then there also were a number of collaboratives that came together, sometimes around ESDs, and then sometimes around districts that had the capacity to help write and organize the mentoring process. And so there were 15 different groups that were awarded. We also offered, yes?
Yes, please.
So one thing that might be helpful, just following on Hannah's comment, is just to get when it's presented, the sort of the total number of new teachers and the ones actually help, so we can see sort of what the gaps are, what the coverage was, and that way we can start drawing conclusions.
And I'll be sure to get that number to everyone very precisely. I should be able to do that in the next day or two. Be happy to do that. So the other thing that we were able to do is work through an e-mentoring opportunity, which was a really high-quality mentoring opportunity, and districts that qualified as small, remote, and rural were able to qualify for those e-mentoring dollars, and they could use some of the flow-through dollars that we put through that formula in order to avail themselves to the e-mentoring opportunity.
What does that look like?
What does e-mentoring look like? I've never, do I answer the question directly?
It's simpler than enrolling online.
Exactly. So it's based on the New Teacher Project, which is what we base the Oregon Mentor Program on, and it's an online version of that. So just wanted to give one direct example of where we went broad. And this is the areas where we went broad around educator effectiveness and Common Core, and Rob spoke to this a little bit earlier. We thought it was really critical since every school district in the state is going to be required to revamp their evaluation system and also be required to implement the new Common Core standards, that all districts receive support in funding and resources and professional development related to these two initiatives. So just wanted to highlight 3 other points as it relates to going broad in this area. Not only were these initiatives combined, money went to all school districts, as we just said, and there's additional resources to small, rural, and remote, as was mentioned earlier. The 4th bullet is really important. As we were asking other grantees to partner, we also had to partner to get this done. And the partnership between OEA, COSA, and the Chalkboard Project on developing this plan, which we'll lay out in a minute, really made this work much, much stronger as a result. So this is the plan of support as it relates to the strategic investment connected to Common Core and educator effectiveness. It started in this past fall of 2013, where districts sent professional learning teams to one of 3 different regional seminars across the state. This resulted in over 1,000 educators receiving really high-quality professional development and time for those district learning teams to develop plans around how they're going to implement the Common Core and their new evaluation system. And now that team is charged to go back to their home districts and lead trainings in their home districts. In January, we then released funding to those professional learning teams, and then there'll be more gatherings like the ones in the fall, both in April and then into the summer. This is just a note on the additional revenue that went to small, rural, and remote school districts. Rob mentioned the ESDs that received grant writing assistance, but in addition to that, 127 districts that qualify as small, rural, and or remote received additional funding, because we know implementing Common Core in Heppner is going to look a little different than it is in Umatilla, which will look a little different than it is in Ione. And those districts then get to choose from these 3 options, either the e-mentoring that we spoke about earlier, or they can gather those resources with their region and really develop a very unique implementation plan that will suit their region around Common Core and educator effectiveness.
Sorry, just to go back to the mentor for just a minute.
Yeah.
So we have all different mentoring programs going on right now across the state. Are we going to use a uniform evaluation tool that will allow us to see what's really working and what's not, so that when we, all of these educators have been through a year of mentoring, we'll have a good sense of effective mentoring programs and maybe not so much? I'm really interested in, Julie asked questions about the e-mentoring. I haven't talked to anyone who's done this. I'd be interested in knowing how that works. But I've seen in my own district, in Beaverton, we've had many different mentoring programs. One of them was phenomenal, and people were raving about how they were really hitting the mark. And I hope that we can learn from this and then build something that really helps those first year, because it's a difficult thing.
So yes, folks will have uniform reporting, so we'll be able to do some analysis of programs of best practice. I do want to add specifically on mentoring, this was actually one of the first investments that our state made. So we invented in a high-quality mentor program prior to 2013, I believe it was a 27 legislative session, and it's based off really strong best practice from the New Teacher Project. So all recipients had to assure us that they were going to follow the best practice indicators that our state has been researching since 2007. So there's still a ton of variance, I am sure, and we'll be able to even more specifically figure out best practice within that, but it did all need to be based off of some best practice indicators that we developed the original program around.
Great. Thank you.
So we also want to talk about where we went deep, and I want to be sensitive to time, so we'll just hit a couple of these perhaps. And you can see we chose just 7 examples of some of those where we went deep. There were many. But support for African American students, Teach Oregon, student mentoring, collaboration, CTE, Scale Up of Eastern Promise, and STEM. And we'll try to hit just a couple of these, and that way, if there remain some questions, we can do that. So the grant on support for African American students was really about wraparound services and make sure that we strengthen the ties between home, school, and community, that we have parent participation, and that we use culturally relevant teaching pedagogy or curriculum. And this was a program, I think I have the awardees for that are listed here, and there are 8 different awardees. And this is a place where where we worked to go deep and make sure that there were a few awardees so that we could see the kind of result that we get from that investment.
And then we wanted to explain Teach Oregon. So we're trying to pick a couple of our favorites from 3232 and 3233, and it's hard because it's funding lots of good work. But Teach Oregon is in conjunction with the Teach Oregon initiative that the Chalkboard is leading. We funded 2 additional sites, so there's going to be 5 total across the state. The state invested in 2, and the original initiative invested in a different 3. It's going to be $500,000 to 2 different district and university partnerships over the course of 2 years. So the total is $1 million because there's 2 initiatives, 2 partnerships. And the partnership is focused on strengthening and transforming the educator prep programs so that the school districts are more closely connected to the teacher prep programs as they're developing students who are then hiring into school districts. These are the 2 sites that the Strategic Investment Funds invested in, Central Oregon, and you see the list of districts, community colleges and university, and the PAC 7, and then again the list of districts, community college and university.
So I'm going to move through these. The student mentoring is very similar to what we talked about earlier with wraparound services and some of the awardees. The collaboration grants is a scale up of a past collaboration grant model. CTE, we can talk about CTE very quickly. And this really was a partnership between the department and the Bureau of Labor and Industries, and this is outside of 3232, but it was a grant program with $8.87 million, and I think some of the programs will be very strong in offering up opportunities for students to have some experiences and figure out what it is that they want to do as they move on through life and what they would become as late as age 25. And then I also wanted to touch real quickly on Scale Up and Eastern Promise. I know that this is one there's a lot of interest in. So about $2.2 million went to the existing program in Eastern Promise so that they can finish their work and act as a model for the rest of the state. And then there were 3 additional collaborative sites that will receive funds in order to scale this up. They need to use the 5 pillars of the Eastern Promise and make sure that they offer within that Eastern Promise model a number of ways to earn college credit. which could include AP and IB, proficiency, dual credit, or CTE credit. And but the details of it beyond that are up for the local sites to determine. And that they would make sure that they award college credit and provide developmental education for students in high school or in the first 2 years of post-secondary ed.
Rob, this is Mark.
Hey, Mark.
Just want to tell you that, obviously this one's near and dear to me, and I'm pretty excited to see the level of interest across the state. I'm expecting ODE to receive some really, really good proposals from all over Oregon. And what I'm hearing from superintendents, whether it's ESD superintendents or even college presidents, is a lot of interest in individualizing and customizing how it looks in their region. So when we talk at OEIB about the importance of scale up, we all know that one size doesn't fit all, but what I'm seeing in this one, I think it's going to be a good example for us in the future, how people will have taken a core concept, as you mentioned, the 5 pillars, but individualizing it for their region. So I think this is going to be exciting to see what proposals come in.
If you hadn't spoken, Mark, I would have been completely dumbfounded when we talked about the Eastern Promise. But I have to tell you, it is a really exciting model, and I just want to say thank you for the good work that you all have done out there and the example that you've been able to provide for the rest of the state. And I know that there is huge interest, and one of the biggest challenges that we've had is really the quality of the applications that we've had are very high in so many of these, and then the challenge to say, and we're going to award here and here, but not over there, it is really difficult. And I know that as I move across the state, there are times when people grab me by the coattail and say, we had a great application, and we really felt like what we were going to do for kids was really going to make a difference, and we didn't receive funding. But and then I have to share that when you stack it up compared to the others, they didn't receive funding. But there are some great models out there, and people are excited. I think STEM is a place where that really exists. So we'll talk about that when we'll be complete.
And how we can leverage both the applicants who receive funding, but then where there's interest, but places that didn't. The last thing we're going to talk about is STEM. So STEM altogether forms approximately $10 million of the $75 million in strategic investments, and in these 3 areas around STEM CTE programs. And that one just closed, so we're in the process of now sorting through those applications and getting them through a review process. We had over 65 applicants for the STEM CTE programs. The STEM hubs, I'm going to get the number wrong, but it was over a dozen also applied for STEM hubs. And then STEM lab schools will be open into the early part of next month. But so as you can tell, there's a real interest in this work statewide, and this $10 million will go to fund these 3 different initiatives.
And lastly, I just would talk about next steps very quickly. We'll finish the process by the end of May, and then we need to make sure that we support and monitor the implementation of the grants that have been awarded. And of course, there'll be various reports and so on to the legislature. This, and I want to say, just kind of make a pitch here a little bit. These funds have been in the hands of school districts either since, in terms of the mentoring grants, since September, or they've yet to receive any. And we're going to apply these and expect to see certain kinds of outcomes. It is a place where the importance of the longitudinal database really comes into play, and being able to track what happens in various places in all parts of the education endeavor. But then here, where we've applied very specific dollars to make sure that we get a different outcome than what we have been able to achieve previously. And then watch what happens to that student as they move downstream through K-12, into the community college or the college, and on into the workforce. And it is a place that just the importance of the longitudinal initiative database and being able to secure that, the dollars in order to be able to implement that effectively is a really important thing for us to know. And that concludes our presentation, probably longer than we intended. We'd love to answer questions or engage in dialogue.
Rob, what is the mentoring of students? What are we paying for? What's the...
Yes, so that's a variety of different programs, but at the end of the day, what we really wanted to make sure is that we did provide wraparound services for students, and so some of this is around check and connect programs. I mean, it depended on what the grantee had written for us, so they turned in their RFP and said, here's what we're going to do to support these students. right? And some of it would be like,
Well, parish over here, 700 students, highest per capita incarcerated parents, right here at parish. I was told, well, first of all, we got the community to come in and mentor. The old farts to get in here to go one-on-one, but not be flaky, but be one-on-one. Does this help enhance that? Or where's the community's getting a pass on this? What are we paying for? I'm talking to myself here now. I'm not talking to you guys. I'm talking to myself. Where in the heck's the community on coming around people to mentor?
so I did skip over a little bit on the student mentoring one, but I would just sort of bring your attention to some of the awardees of these grants, which included nonprofits and school districts and a variety of different providers. So Boys and Girls Club, NIA, Multnomah School Alliance, and then school districts. So there was a collaboration. Really, part of what we wanted to have happen in this one in particular was for there to be some community activity within the support.
Is this a true statistic that if you have 10% real good mentors of an entity, let's take parish, 700 students, if you have 10% mentors, then that will actually be a tide that raises all boats? Is that a statistic you know about? I've been told that.
It's not a statistic I'm familiar with, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Okay.
Rob?
Yeah, who's that? Mark, go ahead, and then...
Hi. Governor, this is Mark. Did you call on me or Mary?
Well, Barry's right here, so we'll call you because we can't see you.
Well, thank you. Sometimes there's a benefit to that, right? Rob, first of all, I love the map. That's great. It really shows the diversity of the state and the access to the strategic initiative. So the map was a very powerful visual. And I also want to commend ODE's work in this area. This was a heavy lift for them. They had it happen to them very, very quickly, and I think you really adjusted a couple months into the school year, Rob, and it seemed like the second and third rounds of the rollouts went very, very smoothly, and your staff is to be commended for that.
Thank you very much, Mark. There were really terrific number of staff who did great work here, and I should be thanking all of them every time that I talk about this because they have done good work. We're not done yet. We have more to do. We do feel like we got better after the first round. We had some experience and we got better at doing this, and that we continue to refine these and improve on them as we go. There are times, however, where we've had to make some small adjustments, and in fact today we pulled back one of the RFPs that we let out. This is the first one that we've done that with because we really didn't feel like we put the RFP out in a way that all parts of the community could respond, and so we're going to put people back in a room and have a conversation about how do we make sure that we put this one out in a way where we get the kind of response that we want and we get the outcomes for students that we're seeking. And that has to do with the one for Native Americans and culturally relevant teaching pedagogy for Native Americans. And so we'll pull that back together and we'll make sure that we get the community together and do that one a little bit better. But beyond that one, there still are learnings in many of them, but they have gone fairly well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Mary?
So what's your thinking about sustainability or scaling? After this money's gone, then what?
Right. It's a really great question. And so on some of these, I think Eastern Promise is a really good example, or the collaboration grants. What we've looked at were programs that were successful in some places and said, these dollars will allow us to replicate this someplace else. And so while these exist one place, the opportunity to scale it up someplace else would be of high value. And so let's make an investment. But once that investment is made, then it needs to be basically sustainable. And we would expect that with this infusion of dollars, that those who receive the funds would put practices into place that would allow these things to be mostly replicated over time. And that's one of the responsibilities that you get when you receive one of these grants.
So is that actually in the requirements?
It is in many, but not all.
And I think it's an interesting discussion for this board to have on what's the next phase of this work into 2015 and 2017. I mean, one idea that I keep coming back to is that where entities are making really great progress as a result of these strategic investments, does the next phase look different than implementing it themselves and instead building their capacity to teach districts in their region to implement in the way they did? So one idea is you have a sustainability fund that's really capacity building as opposed to district or nonprofit entity implementation. So that's the piece that we're sort of coming to, as we now start to see these dollars flow into school districts and other entities, is what's next. And I think there's lots of different ways we can structure that to leverage some of the great work that is going on. But I think what we've seen in Oregon is that there's pockets of great work, and then how do you ensure that this reaches all districts and all kids?
I think there's some criticism that says that the OEIB is a kind of a top-down thing. I think this is a great pushback on people who I talk to about this is a bottom-up deal. And so when these funds go away, what has the community left there in the shell? And they need to be engaged in it. So I would encourage that when you're advancing these funds, what have you, make sure that the whole community is engaged in the mentoring and all, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sweat equity involved for the community to come forward.
Yeah.
I don't know, I want to talk a little bit about the Common Core and what's going on. I think this is one of the major issues that we're dealing with, not only in Oregon but across the nation. And there's a lot of pushback around the Common Core. Spent some time talking with colleagues from around the nation about where we are, where they are, and how we can be successful. The standards themselves, there's some question about whether they're developmentally appropriate. But the real issue, the core of the issue, and I know we put in some time and money to do this, but it's the implementation and the assessments. Our students are not ready for the Common Core. We're changing the bogey now. And we're still proceeding with assessments that are supposedly aligned to the Common Core standards, but we don't know that they really are. They're not ready. We've seen what happened in New York where 30% of students passed. We want to set our students up for that. And I think as we've done our work as a board, we've talked about the need to move fast because students only get one chance at kindergarten and first grade and so on. But I'm not sure if we're really taking the time to really thoughtfully have a plan in place about how do we make sure that educators are trained on the standards. So I see in the fall of 2013 we trained teams, and then the teams were going back. Really not best practice, we all know that, but it's a way to do. It's a way to get the training. We've got to make sure that educators are trained. Then the second piece is you have to give students some time to actually be educated on those standards before we throw them into a testing situation. We see what's going on right now with the OAKS test and how much stress it's causing our students. And I won't even go to the stress of educators and the evaluation, but I'm just talking about the students that we put in front of a computer and they either fail or succeed based on whether they pass this test. Way too much stress for those students. But we need to make sure that they're prepared to do that. And I know that the federal government is putting their own 2 cents in how we need to move this, and we need to, in order to have the waiver, in order to be not on double secret probation, we have to do what we're told. But I will say again, we have an opportunity as a board to put a plan in place that will actually help our students and public education to be successful. And I would challenge us to put that plan in place and then go to Secretary Duncan and along with our congressional delegation and all of us go in hand and say, we want to do it right. We don't want to just do it, we want to do it right. So are you willing to let us do it right, and you're going to push us down the path where we're going to fail? So I know a lot of time and energy is going into this, but I think we need to have a real in-depth conversation about where our educators are, where our students are, and how we have that plan in place. So I think
Well, that's a
For tomorrow's.
there's a big
presentation.
piece, right, and probably three different parts here around Common Core, the assessment that goes along with the Common Core, and then educator evaluation and effectiveness models. And so I'll talk just a little bit about the Common Core. So it is the Common Core and implementation of the Common Core is a big lift. It was adopted by the state board, or the Common Core was adopted by the state board in 2010, so nearly 3 years ago, or more than 3 years ago. And school districts across the state entered into that conversation and their implementation of the Common Core in different places. Even within my own district, I allowed schools to progress at different paces on implementation of the Common Core. So, for example, Tigard High School did that work several years ago and really began teaching students to the Common Core very, very much so. And it took a little bit longer at 12 High School, just based on some of the different work that they were doing when they had time to get there. But I would assert that both of those schools are ready to go now, and teachers are teaching to that standard. There are other places like Umatilla School District where they've been doing, they began that implementation, and every single person in that district is working toward the Common Core right now. And then there probably are some districts where that hasn't happened. And so at the statewide level with these specific initiatives, what we wanted to do is partner with OEA, COSA, and the Chalkboard and say, how do we design up a model with the resources that we have available to try to scale this up as effectively as possible. And what we really did was we took about $5 million that we had for Common Core and about $5 million that we had for ed effectiveness, and we put those two together and said that really, if you're going to think about ed effectiveness and teaching, that we ought to be looking at those standards and thinking about teaching to those standards. It allowed us to offer the training, a train-the-trainer model, where we brought people in from districts and said, let's get really deep about where you are in the Common Core. One of the big challenges for us was what I just identified. Everybody was in a little bit different place. So some districts that said, we feel like we fully implemented, we don't even know if we need any support, and other districts who said, we're just getting going, we need as much help as you can get. And so we needed to be able to differentiate the support that we were able to give to districts. I think that every district came away saying we're better than we were for having participated in the training. So we brought in teachers, administrators, curriculum folks, and said, here's the training that you're going to have, and then design up some of your own model and go back to your district. And then we did flow-through dollars to every district to ensure that they had enough money that they were going to be able to use those resources so that those folks who were trained up could offer some additional training to a larger percentage of the teachers back in their home district. So that was the model that we tried to use on this particular piece. I think it was a really good model. The feedback that we got from districts that have participated in the trainings thus far was very strong. We have 5 days that are slated, 2 days have been completed. Districts said to us, we'd really like to access the rest of these dollars in the summertime or later in the year because we want to be in classrooms. And so we heard that, and we've tried to do 1 more day in the spring and then 2 in June, when hopefully schools are out, unless it snows a whole bunch more between now and the end of the school year. And so that we could do that and have as much training as possible. And it is a big lift. I don't think that in this kind of an initiative that there probably are enough dollars to ensure that every single teacher in the state is trained to the level we want them to be. We can't do that. But in combination and partnership with local districts and with them allocating some of their resources, including Title II funds and the like, I think it helps a lot. I don't know if that answers everything, but that's my thinking.
Good.
So just to follow on your last question, so what would the gap be to training every teacher? Because I think about it, it's like every student has to take the test. So is it the kids whose district doesn't show the initiative, or they roll it out differently? What's the gap? If we know that all kids are going to have to be held to the standard, what would the gap be to provide the support to teachers to be able to have all kids be supported?
So the question is, what would it take to do that?
I mean, because I think that's what you should be aiming for. So
Sure.
what's the gap between what we're doing and what it would take to have all teachers supported, to be able to support all students, since all students ultimately have to meet that benchmark?
we would have to design up and think about a really different model if we were going to say that from the state level, we were going to offer that up and cause it to happen in every single district across the state. Districts have some responsibility to make sure that their teachers are doing a good job of teaching to the Common Core. In fact, I would say that ultimately they have the responsibility to do that. I certainly felt that as a superintendent, that was our responsibility locally to make sure that teachers knew what the standards were and that they were supported in a way that they could effectively teach to those standards so their students could master those and be college and career ready, which is the point of the Common Core. I think that within this, we offer a mechanism for support and a very good start for districts to either finish that work or engage in it more effectively than they had been previously.
Yeah, I guess it wasn't meant as a critical
No.
to OEIB, but I'm thinking if the state board and the state has said that we expect all kids to be at this level, then what's the state obligation to provide support, even if it's delivered locally, the support for teachers? So I guess I'm just interested in what that would take, because if there's a state level standard, how do we provide the support for districts to get there?
It's a budget question, guys.
Yeah, and just capacity.
So we spend a lot of attention on the strategic investments, which we should. It was $5 million to support the implementation of Common Core and $5 million for ed effectiveness, so a total of 10. What Rob mentioned around the Title IIA funds, so SEAs, or local school districts, have access to over $21 million a year in Title IIA money. So that's money for professional development of educators. So that's another huge resource that I think our role is making sure that districts are using that strategically around implementing Common Core. And then I think there's also a case to be made around since it's an ongoing part of teaching and learning, schools have always been teaching the standards, what's the portion of the general state school fund that should be invested in that work locally as well. So there's various pots of money, and I think we could do a little bit more thinking on what that might look like even more coherently. But I think it's important that it's not just the strategic investment money that get used to leverage that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This isn't a criticism of OEIB, it's just an observation of if we've laid that or set that up as the expectation for kids, then what does it take? So is it 100 million, or is it 30 and we're almost there? Just looking at the scope and how do you really do it systematically and then make it sustainable.
And I don't think that I can give you a
You don't
number
have to tell me right now, but I think that's...
And I wasn't taking it as criticism at all. I just was, I wanted to make sure that I shared that there are multiple responsibilities here, making sure that certainly part of our responsibility is to explain what the standards are very clearly, to put those out there so that folks know what they are, and that we create clear assessments around knowing whether or not students have mastered the content and those components. And then in addition, that we offer opportunities around training so that folks within each district have mastered this to the point that they could support teachers and administrators in their own district in their continued training. But I don't have a number for you.
You gave a couple of examples of districts, Tigard and Umatilla, that were well on their way. I'm in my conversations around, I believe there are a lot of districts who aren't there and a lot of educators who aren't there. And that's as Julia is getting at, how do we make sure everyone's there? How do we have a plan? And we're doing some surveying, NEA is doing some surveying. We can work together on making sure that we really know where we're at, because at the end of the day, if we've got educators who aren't prepared to provide the instruction that's necessary, we need to figure out where that is, and we need to take care of it. That's that. So tight and loose. So we say, here's what we want, let you find a way, and then if we can't, then we need to step in and be able to provide the resources and support for them to get there. And I will just say again, I believe there are a lot of educators, a lot of districts in this state who are not properly prepared, and we need to know that going into it, not pretend that it's all okay and that this is going to go smooth. Let's have a really good plan in place to get it right. And let's make sure the assessments are implemented appropriately so our students aren't set up for failure.
Okay, I'm going to actually terminate this now. We are way behind schedule, and would like to get, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we have Yvonne on the phone from Boston. Are you there,
Yes.
Yvonne from Boston?
Yep,
What's wrong
I
with
am
your
on the
car?
phone. Can you hear me?
Okay, please give us the update on your subcommittee.
Okay, thank you for accepting the agenda. I'm sorry I wasn't on earlier. My report's really short. We're doing some great work. The OEIB Best Practices of Student Transition Subcommittee has continued to focus deeply on issues, barriers, and solutions in areas that we identified in our scope of action, which we shared that chart with you early on. I'll just name the areas one more time just to remind everybody. We're looking at student transition in early learning to K-12, student transitions in grades 11 to 14, educator quality, transforming learning through digital conversion, and rural and remote communities. The subcommittee is on track to bring recommended policies and investments to the full board at the April, May, and June meetings, so much more to come on those. The subcommittee feels very strongly that the ODE, EC, and OEIB needs to coordinate efforts and provide practitioners with clear communication around best practices that address birth to 2, full-day kindergarten, etc. And link in what we know works in the areas of second language learners, early literacy, wraparound services, etc. So we're going to be working together with those organizations to see if we can't define that and put that information somewhere where it's clear for everyone in the state what we all see as best practice. And the last thing I wanted to just call out is that the subcommittee will be bringing a list of best practices and recommendations related to educator preparation to the April OEIB board meeting, and would like to provide updates on the scope of work underway in Oregon's educator preparation programs responsive to the findings of the Secretary of State's August audit. We've been hearing multiple presentations. The work is very exciting that's going on, and we haven't had much of that conversation at the board level. So we're going to pull all that together and bring that information to the whole OEIB in April. And that's all I have, unless you have questions.
Any questions for Dr. Curtis? I guess not. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you making the effort to call in.
Sure, you're welcome. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm already here.
All right. I didn't see you. Take it away.
Good afternoon, Governor, Chief Education Officer. Whitney Grubbs, Chief of Staff for the OEIB, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the 15-17 budget process. And I think it's really exciting. I can tell from the last conversation that everyone at the table is really thinking deeply about how we can use the power of this investment board to make a real impact. So I'm going to first draw your attention to a timeline, which is under tab 4. And as Chair Dick Withnell mentioned earlier, the sort of theory of budget development this time is to use the Oregon Education Investment Board and its subcommittees to act as a sort of funding team to help the governor arrive at his recommended budget at the end of this year. And so this timeline kind of lays out the process as we envision it. Obviously, January has concluded, and the Outcomes and Investments Subcommittee did meet in January and begin thinking about, they saw a presentation similar from Rob on strategic investments and began engaging in the discussion of really what are the kinds of investments and strategies and tools to put in place in the next biennium in order to really make a difference. And so I want to talk just a little bit about a few of the ideas that came up in that meeting, because ultimately the full board will see sort of a policy paper that will have some high-level direction and high-level recommendations from the Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee around how we can make the budget recommendations very powerful and successful. So Dr. Golden began our meeting really with this idea that she expressed earlier on, which is how can we ensure that we're thinking about strategic investment in our system not just as a set of grant programs. As what you saw from Rob is obviously a really impressive set of work, and his staff has done a really wonderful job of implementing these 66 different or 33 different initiatives across the state. But I think Dr. Golden is really interested in us thinking about how can we ensure that the strategic investments are even more transformational? How can we make sure that they really are about putting a new system in place? How do we ensure that there is sustainability and that we're using the tools of the larger budget picture? So, for example, the base funding, what kind of tools could we put in place to ensure that we are leveraging districts and how they're using their base funding to make change? And so as we began this conversation, I think it will be really critical for the full board to weigh in. So at the next meeting, I think we might be off on the timeline, the full board will receive this strategy report from the Outcomes Investment Subcommittee, and will be able to engage in a rigorous discussion of these key strategies. Later on, if you look at the timeline, there will be a process by which the subcommittees of the OEIB will be able to feed into the Outcomes and Investments Subcommittee's more specific strategic investment recommendations and policy recommendations, and that the OEIB Outcomes and Investments Subcommittee will also be a place to hear from the Early Learning Council, the Higher Educating Coordinating Commission, and the STEM Council regarding their thoughts around strategic investment strategies. Along the way, we'll have public opportunities for public input, with the ultimate conclusion being a recommendation by the Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee, and then by the full board that will go to the governor to help him guide his decisions around his recommended budget at the end of the year. You'll notice in the footnote that just a reminder that obviously the Oregon Education Investment Board does not have the power to make budget decisions. Its recommendations are advisory to the governor, and then the governor obviously brings his recommendations to the legislature, who ultimately has the final say. And another sort of caution in there, or not caution, but really a parameter, which is that the OEIB will not necessarily focus on dollar amounts or relative funding levels, but really more thinking about the strategies and the levers that we can use, how we can shape these strategic investments to really make change, how we can incent cross-sector innovations, how we can incent the kind of regional collaboration that Dick was talking about, and the community buy-in and engagement. So those are the kind of thinking that will hopefully come out of the board.
Just a comment on the recommendations not focusing on dollar amounts or relatively funding levels. I do think it's important to have an understanding of, if we're doing an investment in a particular area, what sort of capacity as a percentage term might make, so that I think sometimes we get into okay, we put $5 million into Common Core, check, we've done that. So I think just to have an understanding of how much of a lever it actually is, how many kids will be able to impact, how many staff, because then you get a real sense of whether you can check the box or not. So that would be the one thing I would say, is to have a general sense of impact.
I think that's a great point, and in part it sort of comes back around to what Rob was talking about in the strategic investments around kind of the places where you need an investment that's really deep, or a place where you need an investment that's really broad. And I think it is hard to sort of make a set of a priority list, if you will, without knowing the impact of that one priority over another. And so I think in the Outcomes and Investments Subcommittee, there probably will be one layer more of granularity around kind of digging in on some of these pieces and using the data and the evidence that we have in order to determine sort of what the scope of an investment would need to be. I also know that, for example, around some of the conversations happening on funding models for the 11 to 14, the Accelerated Learning Committee, it's a legislative committee that Dr. Golden is chairing, they're actually doing some cost modeling and working out a sort of a potentially revenue neutral kind of formula that could, or strategy that the board could look at. And so I think there will be that kind of information to aid in your decision making as well.
Governor, this is Mark. I have a question.
Yes, Mark. Go ahead.
Whitney, kind of dovetailing on what you're just talking about, when you think about what our role is return on investment. And I'm just curious if there's, as we evaluate the effectiveness of each of these strategic investments, is there a way that we can align it with a return on investment model where, we have consistency somehow where we say, okay, here's the outcomes from the mentoring, for instance, and here is the return on investment that we've received. Is that possible?
That's a great question, Mark. I think it's one you might have asked before a few times. But I think because it is so critical, such critical information. And as Rob mentioned, we're at something of a disadvantage without our longitudinal database, policy database being completed. But I think we are working at looking at some different logic models and assessing sort of the places where some of these investments that we've been making in the state for a while, beginning to unpack sort of the benefit they're having on outcomes, and then doing some modeling around what that would look like if it were scaled up. So I think if that's what you mean really by return on investment, is a kind of comparison between the dollar amount and the outcome for students, we are getting there, but not in the same way as the kind of dashboard model that you saw earlier, just because it involves so many layers of intricacy that we're examining really how to make that the most effective as possible.
Yes, so Mary and then Dick.
There's this tension between base funding and investments. Could you talk a little bit about how the committee is thinking about that? I know we don't get into actual numbers or amounts of money, but kind of what the thinking is. And then secondly, has the committee developed a set of criteria by which they're going to decide about what the priorities and strategies and investments are? Because I think it would be important for the board to be engaged before we get a set of recommendations to talk about the criteria so that we know how to apply and sort through the important things to do.
Definitely. So I'll start with the second one first. So the set of criteria, which I think we called it parameters and priorities, or budget strategy and priorities. You will see a draft of that next month, and that will include the kind of high-level criteria that the committee will have thought about at that point, and they will bring it to you for input and then take it back for more revision before asking for adoption. So I think there'll be rounds of back and forth and engagement around that, because it is a critical piece. While it's not the budget recommendations themselves, it is a driving document that will then help agencies, subcommittees, other boards, stakeholders to really think about how they craft their particular asks of the OEIB. With the first question, I think in some ways it depends on which level of the education system you're talking about. As Ben mentioned, a lot of the conversation around strategic investments has been in the K-12 arena. The Outcomes and Investment Subcommittee is committed to looking more broadly across the birth through college and career continuum to figure out what the best tools are along the way. I think the HEC will engage in conversations around post-secondary budget and as well as allocation, any changes to allocation models that would then, feed into the OEIB conversation. In the early learning and K-12 arena, I think the conversation is just really how we dovetail this accountability piece with the investment piece, and whether there are other levers within the base funding that we haven't utilized, or whether it's more about support and educating folks, providing information about best practices, and things like that. So I think it's still a really robust conversation to be had.
I think, I'll just jump in here, I mean, I think that one of the problems with current service level funding is that you never evaluate really what's going on within base funding. And, I'm not saying that we need to change it, but it's a question that needs to be asked, because that is the bulk of what we're doing. And there's always this tension that if the base isn't enough, we shouldn't be doing these other strategic investments. The question that we need to explore is, could we be spending the money in the base in a different way that drives better outcomes? And I think that's a really central question that we sort of skirted because we were just starting our 10-year budget process last time, but I do think that's one of the issues that we just need to have an honest conversation.
Well, amen to that, Governor. I really agree with you 100%. Well, also to piggyback on what Mark just said, there's also a cost for not doing X, Y, or Z on investments, and we know what that cost is. And this has got to be in the context of what outside of this room thinks. If we're in the bottom 10 out of 50 in our production of education of our young people, then how do we get to the top 10? And so I think we have to look at return on investment, which is, I like what Mark just said, but also there's a cost if we don't do. So we need to know what that is and make those decisions for the income, for the outcome of providing us in a better system than we have right today.
Yeah.
So the HEC, like the ELC and the State Board of Education, I believe, is responsible for recommending to the governor and to this board a budget for higher education. The challenge that we've set before the HEC, given the work of the OEIB and the governor, is the challenge to relate investment levels to outcomes. And we'll be having that conversation over the next several months with institutions. And so, irrespective of what this board does or doesn't do relative to funding levels, I think that that presentation of at X level of investment, here are the outcomes that you can expect over the coming biennium or the coming 4 or 5 years, whatever time period we look at, is at least that's the challenge we have before us, and our goal is to present you with that information.
So I have one other quick piece, and that's to present you a scorecard document, which is in front of you, and I'm just going to very quickly describe how this document is meant to work. So this is meant to be something that will come to you quarterly as a way to gauge the OEIB's progress on key outcomes, as well as the strategies that the board has adopted for moving those key outcomes. So if you open up to the key student outcomes, you'll see in blue the goal pieces are the places where the OEIB has adopted a numeric goal or target for an outcome for 2015. And this will show you sort of a baseline data, a result, and a target if we have it. There are places where we don't yet have the data, but this will show you that. And then under the status, whether or not, where we're at, if we are on track, if the target seems attainable, or if it needs great attention, such as in the third grade reading proficiency, which actually slipped down from 2012 to 2013. And under each of the goals, you'll see strategies. These are the same strategies that this board adopted in its strategic plan in February of last year. And there's a sort of brief narrative of where we're at on the strategy, and then a status bar at the end as well. This is something that will update quarterly for you, while many of the numeric goals will only change annually, just based on the nature of the metric and the data that's available. The strategies will be updated quarterly to show progress in places where we might need to pay attention. So I'll just give folks, on the back too, there's system outcomes, which are really more about building this seamless P20 system. And I just want to point out where it says complete, it makes it look like we've completed it, but that's where the target is actually to complete the item. So for example, the P20 longitudinal policy database, the target would be that we actually have the thing built and completed by 2015. And then there's the current status in the next bar.
Nice piece of work, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Whitney, great job on this. And Governor, this really sells well downtown, where the old Progress Board was and stuff. This is, and I hope the members, fellow commission members, realize that our names are on this thing. And so, I mean, not to do a drum roll or anything.
Is your name on this?
Yeah, yes, Nancy fixed that last week. So the people that do call me now, I can say that we are going to get you as the chairman of this OEIB. We are going to move forward.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got objection. We were going to take a break a quarter hour, but we have people who come for the regional. So any objection? Just roll it on here with. No, hearing none. Okay, great. Whitney, back to you.
So I'm going to be very brief because you're all tired of hearing me, and there's other guests here that have much more important information. But we felt that it was a good time to give you an update on our Regional Achievement Collaborative pilot. We launched the pilot in October of last year, provided funding to 12 different regions who are engaged in various models of, call it collective impact, collective responsibility, basically engaging across the P20 system and with a wide variety of partners around how they can really move the dial on the targets that you see here in this scorecard and that districts and others see on their achievement compact. We have had the pleasure of working on this project with the Oregon Solutions Network. And that is a part of, well, I'll mess it up if I describe it. But the Oregon Solutions Network has provided facilitation support to all of these regions, as well as really helping us define a model for collaborative learning so that what's happening in these regions isn't isolated, but that we're really connecting the lessons learned and best practices and able to bring those both to the regions themselves, but then also back to this board in order to really help to inform your investment and policy making strategies. So I'm going to turn it over to Laurel, and she's going to talk a little bit about the work that she's doing, and then we'll allow some of the collaboratives to come up and give you an update.
Great. Good afternoon, Chief Education Officer and board members. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for your leadership and your service. I'm Laurel Singer, and I am the coordinator of the Oregon Solution Network that has been working with the Regional Achievement Collaboratives. So I want to just briefly give you a little bit of background about the Oregon Solution Network and the work we've been doing with the collaboratives, and then I'll let you hear firsthand from them, from the collaboratives that have come a long way to see you. Just a background about the Oregon Solution Network. Governor Kitzhaber, by executive order in 2011, set up the Oregon Solution Network, which linked the programs of the Oregon Consensus Center, the Oregon Solutions Network, and the regional solutions centers, really to provide an infrastructure to support collaborative efforts in our state, in our communities. So it draws on the expertise of conflict resolution, agreement seeking, intergovernmental alignment and coordination, and project implementation using collaborative approaches. So the quality, I think, that is key to all the Oregon Solution Network work that we do is the idea of being a neutral forum. We don't represent one party, one interest, one entity, but we provide an equal, equal access to all entities as a neutral, unbiased forum to bring people together to do good collaborative work. So we formed a special team of project managers that work specifically with each pilot. So each pilot was assigned its own program manager that would bring the expertise that was needed for that particular region. Every one of these pilots are unique. That's what makes it so exciting. And so we tailor our approach based on what their needs are. For some regions, that's as simple as just checking in and giving some moral support and saying, you're doing great work. And for others, it's really rolling up the sleeves and doing some much more intensive facilitation, strategic planning, prioritizing in order to achieve outcomes. So, as I said, we've been engaged since the beginning and a little bit before. And there's been 3 phases of our work. The first phase that we're in right now has been the startup, just to help convene the groups. In some areas, they've already been working for years together, and it's more just to help maybe supercharge what they're doing and bring it into focus. And so the key of this stage is culminating with the creation of a declaration of cooperation. And that's what I passed out to you, and I'll say just a word about what that is in just a second. And as Whitney said, the other aspect of our work, or the other phase, is supporting learning collaboratives to help create opportunities for learning across regions, across pilots, share ideas, what's working well, share challenges, and try to piece those out together, and just to begin to transfer really good information to see what's working and how it can be replicated. And then the third phase of our work beyond the startup is just to be there for ongoing support, facilitation, conflict resolution, and collaborative support as may be needed. So those are the 3 phases. So I want to come back and talk a little bit about the DOC, which is what all the pilots are working on. We just had the first one that was signed in Malheur, the Malheur RAC. But just a word about the DOC and what that is. A lot of people think it's just a governance document, but it's much different than that. It's really a non-binding document that memorializes the commitments of each entity that's involved in a collaborative process. So it helps catalyze a group from just thinking about what are we going to do to, all right, let's really put the pedal to the metal. Who's going to do what in order to make that happen? And everybody at the table can make a commitment. It's a pretty powerful tool that gets people really catalyzed to say, okay, what are you going to do? And it's a way of really of documenting that everybody's responsibility, everybody is bringing a piece to the table and is responsible for achieving the outcomes. There's a lot of different parts to it, but the main focus of the Declaration of Cooperation is the commitment stage, where each person says what they're going to do and actually signs on the dotted line. It's oftentimes a big ceremony, lots of community attention. And so the first one was just in Malheur. It was very exciting. And I've given you just a little bit of an excerpt of their 28-page commitment of DOC and what folks are going to be going forward. But just an example of the huge but small pieces that people can bring. So for example, in the Klamath Promise, an example of a commitment is the Herald News made a commitment, as they are starting to form theirs, to give a full-page coverage once a week to the regional achievement collaboratives or education-related components, which is a big thing in a community where you're really trying to galvanize attention. So those are the kind of things that we look at really getting communities to commit to, and then created in this document that gets revised over time. So that's just a little bit about our work with this project. It's been an honor, it's been a great partnership, and been a lot of fun. So with that, any questions?
No, Governor, you're wanting to know where Dirk and Riley are. They're not here today, right?
No, they're not.
Great people, I'm telling you.
They really are.
They love that area too, they really do.
Yes, they are just going gangbusters, and it was a very exciting event. And I know we had a video of Dr. Golden, and it really energized the community to begin to move forward.
So my only question with the regional collaboratives is the individuals who are actually engaged in the work. This has been something that I brought forward on, and you gave us an example, and you've got superintendents who have signed on. I'm just wondering how you get, at what point you bring the practitioners who are day-to-day working with students into the mix. Because we've got when we talk about wraparound service, absolutely essential, but I believe that the practitioners who are working with the students have a little better idea of the realities of how things are being implemented. And I worry that sometimes we get this high-level, global, here's what we're going to do, and then it gets, now do this. And it isn't really a plan that works. So at what point do we bring those people in?
That's happening simultaneously. I think the ways a lot of the RACs are beginning to structure is they might have a steering committee, but then they're organized according to initiatives that really get quite down in the weeds and quite engaging at the level that you're talking about, because it's so important to be able to really have somebody on the ground. But I think that's also an issue that some of the RACs begin to struggle with, is how do we engage more and more of that? And I think that's going to be an important piece of that. Yeah.
So I guess I haven't seen that. I've looked at many of the groups. I've seen the lists of people engaged. So maybe if you could give me a couple of examples of the collaboratives and those individuals that are actually involved in the work, that would be helpful for me to understand.
And for many of these RACs, the focus is not on changing day-to-day instruction. It's really about bringing community together to RAC services around students.
Right.
But an example of one where they're actually really digging in around instructional quality and pedagogy is the Mid-Valley, Mid-Coast collaborative, where President Ed Ray is working with Lynn Benton Community College and the Dean of the School of Education. And they're really engaged at the level of teachers from the K-12 districts and community college faculty and candidates in the School of Education at the Oregon State University. And they're creating these teams around math instruction and really digging in to develop professional development plans and plans for looping the School of Education into the mix, and a lot of really exciting activity there. That is really, I think, probably that's the only one that comes to mind where changing instructional practices is sort of the core of the collaborative, but it's a nice example.
And I'm not talking about instructional, I'm talking about working with the students and helping them with the transition. If that's our goal, I think we have to have that input along the way, or else the plans get derailed. So, and I'd love to see the list of those engaged in that work. Thank you.
Anything else? All right, we've got a couple RACs who have come a long way, so I'm going to turn it over.
Let's see. I think we've got Central Oregon Better Together up first.
Welcome. Thank you. Good afternoon, Governor, Dr. Golden, and the rest of the committee. Thank you for having us here. I'm Paul Andrews. I'm the Deputy Superintendent of High Desert ESD, and Anna Higgins is with me here as well. And we just wanted to take about 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about what's going on in Central Oregon. And I want to start just by giving you a little history, and then let Anna tell you about the real meat of the work that we're doing. A few years ago, the Oregon Community Foundation approached us and asked us if we would be willing to work together in Central Oregon to create a culture of higher education. And we pulled together a number of folks, wrote a grant, and agreed to do that. And part of that process, they introduced us to All Hands Raised, based out of Multnomah County, and encouraged us to take more of a collective impact approach, which we started doing at that point. And at that time, we were moving from a planning phase to an implementation phase. It was around the same time as the RACs were being discussed and talking about not just a culture of higher ed, but what can we be doing for students for cradle to career as well. And so we had all those in place before, some pieces in place before the RACs even started. And so wanted to give you a little bit of that history. One of the things we learned, though, is that a lot of the collective impact work that had been done out there was in urban centers. All Hands Raised is a good example of that. Strive, based out of Cincinnati, is an example of that, that this work was based on. And so one of the things we've come to really appreciate with the Regional Achievement Collaboratives is that rural entities like ours in Southern Oregon, I believe, is going to be talking as well, need to be looking to each other, need to be talking to each other about how are you doing it in a regional setting as different from the urban lessons that some of our partners have taught us up to this point. So we're pleased to have the ability to do that through the RAC process. And I want to let Anna share with you specifically. I believe you have handouts. We basically just wanted to give you 2 quick handouts to let you know who we are, what we're doing, and then be able to answer some questions for you. So I'll turn it over to Anna at this point.
A follow-up or leading from what Paul said, we are feeling really proud and excited about the momentum that is building in Central Oregon. In less than a year, we've been able to go from a region that is intrigued by the idea of coming together to solve a complex problem using the collective impact model to a region that has organized and identified 4 specific areas. This handout that we've given you, the back side of it, is a nice visual for these 4 areas. From the ground up, these areas were identified along the cradle to career continuum and have served really since that time as a framework for the community, and very much in a cross-sector fashion with some key champions early on from both private and public sectors. It has served as a framework for them to drill down from, starting with this big vision of cradle to career and looking at student success and understanding that we need to do that along the continuum with aligned efforts. Not only the existing efforts, but new innovation along this continuum. The work groups really gather around this hope and promise of collective impact, and it has been, like I said, very exciting to watch how, with relative ease, the groups have been able to mobilize to action. So they did the important work. Each of these areas have begun or are in process of doing that important work of identifying what their actual goals will be and marking, figuring out the indicators that will mark progress to those successful goals, and have used that, again, a bit drilled down from the initial framework, to mobilize fairly quickly. And an example of this is, if you look on the far end of the continuum, the Education and Training to Career Work Group, which is a really nice example of a cross-sector group who have come together. And one of the examples of how they mobilized was there was a Department of Labor grant that came out right late fall as we're moving into the holiday season. And in that 6-week time frame with the holidays in that, the group was able to come together as a region. And our region is 3 distinct counties, Kirk, Jefferson, and Deschutes counties, including Warm Springs Reservation. We have 6 school districts, just a handful of large businesses, and lots of small businesses and nonprofit organizations. So when we say our region, that's what we're talking about. So folks, representatives from each of those parts of our region came together in this 6-week time frame and did some system change thinking and work that was incredibly swift. And I really credit that work and the swiftness and the ability to mobilize based on this framework that they were moving within, that again has this engagement that has only come because it came from the ground up. There was a swell from the community with some early champions, and that momentum continues to build in these work groups. Another example, if you look just one notch down on the continuum, the bridge programs, the purple. Another example of this work, much of this work is saying within our framework that we've identified, let's go back and look into the community and say, what already exists? We are a region that doesn't have a lot of doors to knock on. And we are
we are obliged to be partners with the doors that are there. And so going and saying what already exists based on the goals of this bridge program, which is to bridge vulnerable periods along the continuum. And there was a group that has been gathering for about a year called the Cascades Commitment, which is a group of higher education folks and K-12 educators and leaders who have come together to really get clear on what offerings, what dual private offerings they would like all students in our area to have access to. And so it was a very nice alignment. Their work fit very well under this framework of the bridge programs and the Better Together work. And when we talk about mobilizing this group, the work that they had done to this point, and now with the upcoming Eastern Promise Replication Grant, and the purposeful alignment with Better Together really enables this type of work to move forward in a swift way. I think that's the detail that I'd like to share from you.
As far as one last thing to share, the other page that you have has to do with the indicators that, again, as you talk about bottom up and making sure that all of the partners that we have at the table, whether it's K-12, higher ed, business, community, nonprofit, et cetera, did address which indicators they want us to be looking at with all of this work. And so we included that on the list as well. And you may recognize some of them as they came from your office, at least in part, from your work through the Achievement Compact. But in addition to that, we addressed other things as well. Is everyone seeing what I'm seeing? Did that not make it in? Okay, great. It looks it's got green, yellow, and orange on it.
Six.
Thank you. And so the notion here is that there are some indicators that we are going to use to see how do we know we're moving the dial, that needle is really moving. And so we will use much of the Achievement Compact information, but there are other bits of information that individual collaboratives also wanted to stress, and we wanted to share that with you as well. That again, that came from a number of different directions, including from your work, but also from the ground up as well from ours. In terms of just a couple challenges that we're running into or wonder about in the future, two kind of come to mind. One is the sustainability of this over time. We have been going after very many grants. We mentioned the Department of Labor grant, $2.5 million we're going after for education to career. We plan to apply for the Eastern Promise Replication Grant. We just put in for a letter of intent with the PG Foundation. That's where right now we're seeing a lot of the replication going on. The money we received from the RAC has allowed us to have a stable, very competent, incredible coordinator able to guide this, but in order to sustain, we're going to have to find other resources as well. So that's a challenge we're working on, but anticipate to be a continuing one. And then the second is data needs. And we're starting to work on that one as well. We use some of the money from the RAC funding that we received to work with Jefferson County, Deschutes County, Crook County, and our CCO to together hire a data analyst. And all of us are sharing that data analyst together. And just this morning we met with her to look at our work related to the Early Learning Hub, which, as you can see, is part of our continuum as well. And so by sharing that person, we see it as being a way to align dollars much more successfully, while also recognizing that for this to work, that backbone organization, which right now is being housed at High Desert ESD, has the tools to be able to provide all the initiatives, all the work groups with what they need to be successful.
This is really pretty exciting. We were over there on the 21st, a number of us. We had a meeting that was convened. Actually, it was convened by President Johnson in lieu of my colleague who chairs the Regional Solutions team over there. We had the CCOs, we had the Local Workforce Investment Board, we had the Early Learning Hub, and the purpose was really to ask exactly those questions. How do we scale this up? How do we sustain it over time? How do we make sure that we have the conditions and resources for you to succeed from the ground level? And one of the things that I think probably more than any other group, except maybe the one down in Wayne County, there really is buy-in and engagement of all those different groups. The idea of sharing data and having one person in charge of that is just really brilliant. So really appreciate your leadership in Central Oregon. It's just great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over. Welcome.
Governor Kitzhaber, Dr. Golden, and members of the Oregon Education Investment Board, I'm thrilled to be here, a little bit nervous. And my name is Scott Perry, I'm the superintendent of Southern Oregon ESD. And when I was contemplating my nervousness, I typically am not nervous in front of groups. But I thought, there's actually two components to my nervousness. One is that I'm speaking to kind of the who's who of education leadership in the state, and that has me a little nervous. But I think even more is I realize that I'm representing a whole lot of people in Southern Oregon who are now involved in Southern Oregon success. And I'm also a part of another regional achievement collaborative, and that is the Klamath Promise. And so when I speak for those folks, I really want to get it right. And I don't have all the knowledge that all those folks do combined. So I'm going to give it my best shot. When I think of Southern Oregon Success, and Southern Oregon Success is the Regional Achievement Collaborative for Jackson and Josephine County. So we're talking Grants Pass, Medford, Ashland, that area. When I think about who we are, I actually think that we're kind of like the OEIB of a region, at least in terms of membership. When we started the Southern Oregon Success conversation, it was back in 2011, and it started off with really a lunch conversation between the ESD, the road workforce folks, and the Commission on Children and Families at that time. And we just started talking about what can we do together to make our efforts compatible and working together in behalf of children, young children, families. We really envisioned at that time in a small group what we call the Buck Stops Here organization. We said, you always say they ought to do something about this, and we are they. If we don't do it, nobody will. So we really need to create an organization that is a Buck Stops Here organization. And so we started that process, and we took the whole 40-40-20 element as our aspirational target and started to pull together other members of the community. At that time, the Southern Oregon Early Learning folks were already starting to work on coming together around increased communication among early learning providers and anticipating an application for an early learning hub. We were well on the way with this work by the time the Regional Achievement Collaborative funding became available, and that was a wonderful boost to our infrastructure. So I want to give you just a little bit of the kind of the high-level background, and then I want to really focus in on something that is exciting. We've got an expression in Southern Oregon: talk cooks no rice. And so we're really into cooking rice. We're not into diagramitis and talk. We're really trying to cook some rice and really make impact with students. The question that I heard, and I've got an example that I think will show that. So this is a basic diagram. Southern Oregon Success is a group. We meet once a month, and we hear reports out from early learning, from K-12, and from the group that's working on the higher education, or the K-12 to school to work, school to higher education. That's what we call it: school to work, school to higher education. So we've really got these three major thrusts that are all working on their own and then reporting out. So Southern Oregon Success really hears these reports out, looks for ways that we can advocate for the region, looks for ways that we can tie our efforts together. Our membership, and I got to tell you, on the way up here from Southern Oregon today, my wife was looking over this PowerPoint, And she said, do all those people really come to the meetings? Or is there any fluff in here? And I looked through and I said, you know what, almost every single one of these folks I have seen in a meeting within the last month. And so this is not a list of fluff. These are just the actual people. So you'll see that we have regular attendance from Rogue Community College, regular attendance from Southern Oregon University, from a variety of folks in the early learning community, folks that work in our organizations such as College Dreams and the Maslow Project that support students who are at risk. The Job Council and the Rogue Workforce Board are very much involved on a regular basis in leadership roles. And I like this diagram because it's K-12, higher education, local business, and then other youth support programs that are all working together around some common goals. This slide gives just a little bit of history, but that's a little bit boring, so I won't go into that one. I want to focus in on just one example. Put a magnifying glass just for a second on the school to work, school to higher education. So you get an idea of some of the kinds of activities that we're doing. This school to work and school to post-secondary group, as we were talking and meeting in a room, talking about what we could do to support students in the transition, we became very aware that we really didn't know what we were talking about. We had a lot of theoretical information, we had research, but we realized that we needed to actually go to the high schools and figure things out. So the first thing we did is we gathered research together and said, what does a high school have in place that is really doing an excellent job of promoting post-secondary, encouraging post-secondary involvement with students? What do they have involved in place? And we developed this slide that you're looking at, this tool. And essentially, it's modeled after PBIS, it's modeled after RTI. It essentially looks at schools that are doing an effective job have things that are in place for all students at the universal level. They have parent support systems. They have systems of support for small groups, for individuals, and then community. And if a high school has all of these screens in place and working well, then students are going to be caught by the screens. They're going to be encouraged to go on to post-secondary if they're universal things. A number of students will be just enthralled by what's happening at the universal level, what all students are receiving at that high school, and that will be sufficient for them to go on to post-secondary opportunities. For some students, that's not enough. They drop through that screen. They need parent support. Others need small group support. They may be a member of an at-risk population that needs particular attention. And then other students have high needs. No matter what other supports are in place, they need some very intensive support at that community support level. And with this, and you have this entire tool in your packet, it's in the right-hand side at the end, we developed an assessment tool that goes along with this screen that essentially asks the high school, is this in place, partially in place, or not in place at your school? And it goes through systematically a number of different encouragement kinds of supports, activities, processes. And what we did is this. This is the most exciting part to me. We divided ourselves into teams of 4 in the Southern Oregon Success Group. And we went out and we visited every single high school in Josephine, Jackson, and most of the high schools in Klamath County. We gave them that tool in advance. We had the administrative team and the counselors to complete that tool. And then we went in and we interviewed them. And we got detailed information about what they had in place and what they didn't have in place. We collected all that data together, and then in December, we had what we called a post-secondary convocation at Southern Oregon University, where all the high schools came together, and we showed and we talked about what were the regional trends that we saw. Let me back up for just a second. In those interviews, in addition to this information, we had the report card data, and then the Oregon Solution Network helped us link with Echo Northwest, and they did analysis, and you have a sample analysis. They did an analysis of every high school in terms of how many students in that high school go on to post-secondary. Those students who go on to post-secondary, especially community college and four-year universities, how many stay after 1 year, what are their completion rates. They were able to provide us a lot more information than I realized we had in terms of data. So we were able to go in with these data elements and have very rich conversations with the high schools. Brought that back and developed a regional picture of what, for example, this is Jackson County. Where are they at in terms of various strategies, things that they have in place? What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses? And what are some things that we can do as a region to support our high schools very specifically around the things that they need to do? One example was Rogue River High School. I was in an interview with Rogue River High School, and the principal said, you know, we're having a lot of difficulty getting parental support for post-secondary, getting people excited. Last year, we had a college and career night, and we had 4 people come. Just 4 people. And we advertised it well. We had great presentations from the community college, SOU, etc. But we just don't, we have a culture here that is just not interested in going on to post-secondary. And I said to the principal, I said, well, how about if you and I go out and knock on doors and visit some of these parents and see if we can stimulate some interest? And he said, I'll take you up on that. That turned into numerous members of Southern Oregon Success and Rogue River High School, superintendent, principal, counselors. We went out as a group on Saturday, December 21st, and we were able to visit, essentially all the juniors and seniors at Rogue River High School we visited. We didn't get them all there. My wife and I had 18 on our list, and we got 15. But we gave them a personal invitation to a college and career night. The event was very well done, and we had well over 100 people that attended that because we made that specific connection. It was an example of something that really mobilized that community, and it's an effort that we're going to repeat. So we've got this rich data from our high schools. It's informing us as a collective community about specific activities that we can engage in. And now we're starting to move on those activities. Some of the things, organizing our career-related learning opportunities in a more clear way, working with our high schools and our community college and university to better align curriculum to make it so that more teachers are able to offer college course credit. There's actually just a list of things that came out of that process that we can work on as a community, and we're very excited about that process. I just want to make one mention of the Klamath Promise, because I'm also working with them around their Regional Achievement Collaborative, and they have selected as one of their activities that they want to also do a door-to-door campaign. And they asked me if I'm speaking to you, if I would please mention that you are all invited to join them later this spring, and we'll get you an invitation. But we figure if the Klamath Promise community and the OEIB and the ESD are all working together, think of how many students we can reach. And I've got to tell you, at that college and career night, for example, the RCC, SOU, OIT, the Army did a presentation. The Rogue Workforce Partnership did a presentation on job training kinds of options. And I think the best presentation was from TRIO, a woman who stood up and really talked frankly about financial aid and how to get it. And she declared herself as the queen of the FAFSA. She said she's never met a FAFSA that she didn't like, and she could get people dollars that they don't realize they can get. It just relaxed tensions about, people started to realize I could go on to post-secondary kinds of opportunities. So that's Southern Oregon success in a specific example, and if you have any questions, I'll entertain those. Otherwise, I'll hop off them.
Thank you. Any questions for Scott?
Just a comment. I love just getting right out into the community. Just getting out at the grassroots level is really how you're going to connect. Inviting parents and students into the conversation is the only way to turn it around. So,
When you brought that up earlier, I wanted to jump up and say, because it just goes back to that talk cooks no rice example, and we really do need to get down into the reality of these things.
Do you have Sid DeBoer knocking on doors for you?
Not yet. Actually, though, I'm in Rotary with Sid, and
I know enough about him that we could get together.
Yeah, if you could put in a good word for us with Sid, I'd appreciate it. Sid is the owner of Lithium Motors, pretty big influence down there.
The governor apologizes. He was just enjoying this so much, but he did need to go on to his next thing. And I just wanted to say, Matt, with both of these collaboratives, and the energy in the room is really unbelievable. And even though you're doing some different things, you're all doing some things very much alike, which is engaging your communities and your partners with an eye on all the outcomes. So I appreciate the leadership for both of them.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break. We're a little over time, so you're, instead of 15, if you could just take 5 minutes and then come back and we'll see if we get lots of time here. If I could ask people to return to their seats.
Got the big go.
Yeah. You scared them? Yeah.
She's called president for
Yeah, really.
ballot.
It's on my weightlifting. So we're going to start with our agency updates, and let's start with Jada, Early Learning Council.
Thank you very much, Chief Education Officer Nancy Golden and OEIB members. Thank you very much for asking me to do a quick update. I am going to focus my update today on the look back of the kindergarten assessment. The council members will join me in April for our full ELC update for you. When the governor and Nancy talked earlier about some of the kindergarten assessment, we have the look forward that looks forward to the 3rd grade reading, and then we have the look back, and that's really addressing many of the early learning initiatives that we are working on. And so I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of history, because I know that whenever we do a big release of anything, there's always a lot of information and probably questioning about some of the work that we're doing. The kindergarten assessment was really a very thoughtful process. If you look in statute, it was the Early Learning Council was to design and implement, and they were to work with the Department of Education. And we think that that was one of probably our best signature efforts together as we were coming together as the Department of Education. There was as you well know, Oregon has many research experts within our own borders, and we used many of them in the development of this, as well as the Ford Foundation, where we did an assessment of the kindergarten pilot to make sure that what we were doing was what we wanted to be able to do. Oftentimes it's easiest for to talk about early literacy and early math as the only part of this assessment, and I really want to let you know that probably the most important part of that assessment is the Child Behavior Rating Scale, which is a national tool that has been used across our nation. And one of the things that we talk about there are the self-regulation. Ben's over there nodding because his dad knows that he deals with that in an early learning environment every day. And it's often something called executive function, and that's something that executive function in young children is the way that they really address themselves with their peers, as well as looking at taking direction and things like that. The reason executive function is so important is that's really the indicator of future success for kids. So when I talk about learning to learn, as we look at this, it's really about grit, tenacity, and perseverance. Those are the kinds of skills that we want to make sure that kindergartners learn as they come into school, because if they give up too easily, it doesn't matter as the future goes on, because we know learning is hard. It has several times that it's really hard for them to learn when they're learning to read, when they're learning some of their literacy and their math skills, and truly as being part of that new environment. So if they're going to achieve the way that we want their grade reading, we're going to have to give them those opportunities to engage and develop a richer set of skills. How are we going to do that? Basically, as we look at that, the early learning hubs are one of those examples. The hubs are just redesigning the way early care and education are delivered locally. As you heard the governor talk about it, he talks about a scattershot approach, and we're really looking community by community to address that. And you heard that both with the two regional collaboratives that you heard today. We're right in the middle of standing those hubs up, and you'll hear more about that, but we have the first up to 6 that are, we're hoping to get up, and then we're going out for the second round as we were directed by legislation. And then the third part is working together with the Department of Education. We have been able to be part of the 9-state consortium, and we don't know too much yet what that is about, but we have our first meeting in March. We're part of 9 states that are going to be able to look at formative assessment, working with teachers to give them tools to be able to change that instruction, as well as looking at the early learning to say, how are our early learning standards? Are they exactly what we need, or can we look at those to be able to update it to fit this P20 system? And then finally, as you heard also from Nancy Golden, we're looking at that laser-like focus area in the 3 years through 3rd grade. It isn't that we don't have the full spectrum of early learning, but what we really need to do is focus in that 3 years through 3rd grade to make sure we're doing all of those things to align right. And then part of what Rob did not mention in his previous strategic initiatives is we are in the process right now of having 2 elements. One is the Kindergarten Innovation Fund that you as OEIB helped us to determine that criteria to be able to do. That went out last week, as well as the early literacy. And we're hoping both of those strategic investments will move the dial for 3rd grade reading. Thank you.
Thanks, Jana. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to Bob Brew from the Oregon Student Assistance Commission. Access.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. For the record, my name is Bob Brew. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Oregon Student Access Commission, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to give a brief update. The winter is a very busy time at OSAC. Our scholarship application opens to students in November, our outreach programs ramp up, and the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, goes live at the beginning of January. Since OSAC is the official repository for FAFSAs in the state, and the FAFSA is also the application for the Oregon Opportunity Grant, this is a critical time in the agency's yearly calendar. The current FAFSA remains open for 18 months. Students can apply now through the start of the fall term and throughout this coming school year through June 30th. So it's hard to compare to year so early in the season. That being said, however, we do know that the bulk of our FAFSA filers completed as early as possible, and when we compare the dates year over year, we can get a pretty good guesstimate of the number of FAFSAs filers, or more specifically, likely eligible Oregon Opportunity Grant recipients. The 2011-2012 school year, that is 2 years ago, appears to have been our high water mark. We've seen the number of Opportunity Grant eligible applicants decrease slightly last year, and we appear to be seeing the same again this year. As we dig a little deeper, this reduction seems to be concentrated at the community college level. When we talk to our partners in that sector, this is consistent with what they've been seeing. During the recession, community colleges saw a large increase in the number of unemployed and underemployed new students anxious to acquire new skills. Many of those have now achieved their academic goals and have either found work or moved on to four-year universities. So they've been predicting a drop in enrollments, and we're seeing that in Opportunity Grant applications as well. At this point in time, we've seen a slight drop in the other 2 sectors as well, that is public four-year and private four-year universities. But the drop is so slight, it could well be within a reasonable margin of error. I've mentioned, just for point of comparison, during the first year of the biennium, we awarded $55.6 million in opportunity grants. Depending on what the legislature does with our budget this time, we'll be awarding between 56 and 58 million out of this current year. I mentioned that the OSAC scholarship season is underway. OSAC is unique in the nation in that we are a government agency that centralizes and distributes most of the privately funded scholarships in the state. Through our partnerships with the Oregon Community Foundation, the Ford Family Foundation, and many private donors, we were able to award nearly $17 million of private funds to Oregon students. Currently, we have more than 480 individual funds that make awards based on a wide range of criteria. Some require need, some do not, some require a high grade point average, while others have no specific GPA requirement, or even specify a GPA that is too high to qualify. Some are specifically for 4-year programs, some are specifically for 2-year programs, some can only be used in Oregon, while others can be used throughout the country. If you can imagine a student, we probably have a scholarship program that would fit them. Last year, OSAC undertook a major rewrite of our scholarship application, but the project was undermanaged and under-resourced. Due to problems with the application, the number of applications for our scholarships was significantly down. However, I'm glad to say that our system is humming amazingly well this year, and as of today, applications are at an all-time record. Coming up, we have our early bird deadline for applications on February 15th. Students that complete and submit their applications by that date will be entered into a drawing for one of 17 $500 early bird scholarships. The application deadline for all applications is March 1st. By that date, we expect to have more than 13,000 submissions and will distribute more than 3,500 awards. This scholarship program makes the application process easy for students and donors and is entirely self-supporting. OSAC also manages the Aspire Mentoring Program. Aspire is an acronym that stands for Access to Student Assistance in Reach of Everyone. And we received a large infusion of funds through House Bill 3232 in the last legislative session. Through the Aspire program, Aspire funds a volunteer coordinator at 137 schools and community organizations throughout the state. These coordinators are provided with training, materials, and supervision, and they in turn supervise and train a cadre of volunteer mentors. These mentors meet with students and help them plan and prepare for their post-high school educational path, whatever it may be. This program is open to all comers. Currently, the program has about 1,400 volunteer mentors and serves about 8,500 students a year. We hope to be able to expand the program to more sites in the future. Our goal at OSAC is to be a statewide clearinghouse for unbiased information about secondary education opportunities and funding. To that end, we dedicate a good deal of our staff resources to outreach. During the fall and winter, we have given presentations and staffed college fairs throughout Oregon. We also have participated in 21 college nights sponsored by high schools. To encourage completion of the FAFSA and application for the Oregon Opportunity Grant, OSAC sponsored 23 college goal nights throughout the state and helped more than 840 students and parents complete their FAFSA on-site. And in partnership with the State Treasurer's Office, we have co-presented at 6 events focused on paying for college now and in the future. We maintain a presence on Facebook and remind students of important deadlines or helpful tips via Twitter. In addition, we produce and provide podcasts on scholarships, financial aid, and more. For the record, none of these activities are discretely funded in the OSAC budget, but we consider them to be core to our mission, so we prioritize outreach at every level of our organization, leveraging any opportunities we can. In addition to these activities, I've been actively involved in the work of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission's task force on the Opportunity Grant redesign, the Pay Forward Payback Initiative, and the FAFSA completion project. During the current legislative session, we have specific interest in several bills that I could talk about, but I'll make myself available for any questions you might have.
Thanks, Bob.
Chair?
Yes.
I'm a recent surviving parent. My daughter graduated in May, and with 5 degrees between us, my wife and I, and my daughter, negotiated and tried to fill out the appropriate forms. You just mentioned that there's some outreach activities, and you also mentioned podcasts. Are the podcasts available for lower income and poverty immersed parents and families? And do we seem to be making some kind of inroad there?
Yes, our podcast, we actually have I believe we have a YouTube channel, an OSAC YouTube channel that contains all of our podcasts. So anyone that has access to a computer and the interwebs can get a hold of those podcasts. And they're very popular.
Chair? This might not be totally germane, but are we doing anything for incarcerated adults and Oregon Youth Authority people? Because the ROI there for education for reentry is very significant as far as recidivism goes.
I don't know that we're doing anything specific in terms of outreach, although we have been approached by Oregon Youth Corrections to potentially start an Aspire site within their facility. And that's something we're very interested in doing if we can make it work.
So let's get together then. Can we do that?
Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So before we move to our ethics training, we will take public testimony at this point. Just want to remind people that we're limited to 3 minutes. We encourage groups with a common purpose to designate a spokesperson, and that we won't respond directly to public comment, but we'll ask our Chief Education Officer or other agency leaders to respond at their discretion. Looks like we have 3 speakers, 3 minutes each, and the first is Kent Neely from the Oregon University System. So you were just...
I was just signing in.
Not for public comment. Okay, thanks, Kent. So let's move on to Steve Buell, Oregon Senior Schools.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Buell, one of the founders of Oregon Save Our Schools. And I had 2 quick comments, and then we have my presentation, so to speak. One, kindergarten teachers that I've talked to really think the kindergarten assessment is extremely weak and isn't doing much for them. They're nothing but negatives that I got out of the kindergarten teachers I've talked to, which is quite a few teachers that I've talked to. That's one thing. So I think it's worth looking at. The whole Common Core idea about changing kindergarten, we're going the right directions. It'd be nice if we look at that. Secondly, I think it's wonderful that Plymouth people knocking on doors. It's nice to see those people out directly having some impact on kids. So that's wonderful. You all at the OEIB cut a break around 2 weeks ago. Tom Olson, one of the founders of Oregon Save Our Schools and a frequent testifier before this board, died. He was instrumental in pointing out several miscues the OEIB has made. It started with the lack of real teacher input during the LearnWorks phase, which Tom pointed out correctly was dominated by the Oregon business plan, not by Oregon educators. He commented on the lack of support in your first public forums, where your strategic plan was not supported. Instead, Oregon citizens noted we need more direct help at the school level. He condemned the closed meetings of the Governor's Committee, which adjusted this plan and pointed out that it wasn't actually adjusted at all. He noted that when you sent your strategic plan out again to public forums, that out of the many people testifying, there were only a handful who supported your plan. And when you sent the basically unchanged strategic plan off to the ODE for implementation, he was saddened that teachers had had almost no involvement in the plan. But he didn't stop there. He wrote about your work, including a paper which questioned the validity of 40-40-20, and he wrote about your reticence to deal with poverty as a barrier to education, and was instrumental in supporting the legislative bill which passed directing the ODE to study the effects of poverty on education in Oregon. One of his most interesting research findings was in discovering the worthlessness of your appraisal reports on focus and priority schools. After spending $800,000 to study these schools, the ODE sent out a boilerplate report which not only didn't address any specific problems in these schools, but failed to follow the waiver by having the reports written by people other than the ones who had visited the schools. He was here when your data consultant testified that the new longitudinal database you were contemplating had no input from teachers and was of no direct value to the OEIB. He was instrumental in pointing out that many of your grants and investments could be better spent on direct services to classrooms. He had nothing good to say about the investment policy and philosophy, at least as it is played out in your political sphere. But most of all, he was upset about your unwillingness to take leadership in addressing poverty in a manner which made sense for the children in our most struggling schools. As a young man, he had taken part in the voter registration movement in the South
Could you wrap up,
and
please?
retained until he died a genuine sense of justice which he carried over to education. We, his friends and his colleagues in Oregon Save Our Schools, will miss him, as will the children of Oregon. Yep, we caught a break 2 weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
I know I want to.
Rex Higgins?
Yes, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Rex Higgins. I'm also with Oregon Save Our Schools. And I want to talk to you about something different. Tom was a lifelong friend of mine, and I mourn his passing. But what I really mourn is losing his expertise. I want to point out to you that I'm concerned about several things. First, the tests. These tests that are coming out from the Common Core are under fire everywhere. Everywhere. You know that. Surely you know that. Read up. I know 150 early childhood educators of national stature signed a petition saying stop them. So that's one. And I would say that's the biggest one. I'm glad Samuel showed up because I can tell all of you what I told him once. Some of you used to be my friends. That I'm at 75. I hope I lived another 10 years because I would then see him claiming he had nothing to do with this. I would seriously urge those of you that are younger to think about that. You guys are outrunning your coverage. When these tests hit the streets and, 30% of the kids don't pass, you're going to explain that to the parents? I wish you luck. I really do, because I don't think you can do it. There will be repercussions all over the place, and you will lose what you have gained. The governor is a very visionary guy. I admire him for that. I worked many times with some of you on almost all of these kinds of projects we hear here. This is a nice assortment of projects. It's a nice stew, but it's only a stew. You're just now beginning to talk about replication. Really? It takes money. It takes time. Have you consulted any experts at all on this business of replication? And there are a lot of them in the country. Importantly, are you all comfortable that there will not be lawsuits that are successful on the basis of children whose privacy may be violated by this testing monolith? That's not an easy question. And there's lots of people that are not lightweights going after that all across the country. And I think you are putting your faith in the wrong people if you're trusting the testing experts on this, including those in the Oregon Department of Education. It's very iffy. So I would urge you, and the teachers, I think, are very near rebellion. People tell me the teachers like the Common Core. That, my friends, is not true. We'll soon see evidence of that. If you are as wise as I hope you are, you will pause in this mad rush to wherever hell it's going. Take a year off. Take 2. Not only is it a matter of training the teachers, it's a matter of educating the public, and it's really a matter of somebody looking into the validity and developmental importance of those tests. Do not take the word of Tony Alpert. I love him. He's a test guy. He wouldn't know developmental importance if you hit him in the head with it. I guess the last thing I would really like to say, and I'm serious, I really would like to see this succeed. Most of it. But if you do not stop that testing thing before it blows the lid off, and if you are part of a situation where the state of Oregon is sued for violating students' privacy, You will seriously regret it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex.
Yes, question.
No, I said thank you.
Oh, doctor. I know nobody has questions.
Okay, we're going to move on to the board ethics trainings. I'd ask Ron Gerson and Russ Kassler to come up.
Excuse me, could I say just one other thing? You folks use Linda Darby Hammond extensively. I would urge you to talk to her about the two questions of the tests and whether the teachers are with it. Talk to her.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is Russ Kassler. I'm a trainer and program analyst for the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. With me today is Ron Burson, our executive director. I want to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm relatively new to the commission. I came here in October from the legislature. I actually spent some time back in 2011 working for then Representative Cannon. So it's good to see you today. And both Ron and I are members of the Oregon education system. He's a beaver, I'm a duck. I hope neither of us have issues or won't hold that against us. But we're here today to deliver some training, so I want to get into that. First, the Oregon Government Ethics Commission was established in 1974 in response to the Watergate scandal. And it was established, enacted by voters in 1974. It's a 7-member commission made up of volunteers just like you folks, staffed by 8 folks, the executive director, 2 trainers, 2 investigators, and 3 administrative staff. We're a fun bunch of people. And if you have questions, by the way, which you'll have time here at the end, know that you don't have to save them all for us here in this training. You can always call us and contact us, and information will be provided for you at the end. So the agency has 3 main areas of jurisdiction, but we'll only cover one today. And that's the Oregon Government Ethics Law contained within ORS Chapter 244. We're going to focus specifically on 3 areas of that jurisdiction, but it gets pretty broad. It's not always clean. There's some messy issues, and so in order to fit this into a half hour, we've distilled some of that into understandable points for you folks. But we also have jurisdiction over lobby regulation and the executive session provisions of ORS Chapter 192660.
Can I just say one thing? When I was a superintendent and I filled these quarterly reports out, I found your office very helpful. So whenever there was a question, we could call and really get clarity. So I think it's important for all of us to know as we go through this, because it's really helpful to know you're so responsive if we need a question answered.
We really do try. I mean, some of these issues are complicated and do take some time to respond, but to the best of our ability, we try to turn around your questions and your inquiries for guidance and advice pretty quickly. So let's start with some definitions, because as you probably know, with all areas of law, a lot of it comes down to definitions. The big one is public official, which is found in ORS 244, section 020, sub 14. A public official is any person who serves the state of Oregon, any of its political subdivisions, or any other public body as an elected official, appointed official, employee, agent, or otherwise, irrespective of whether that person is compensated for their services. So you all are public officials. Hopefully you all knew that, but if you didn't, surprise and congratulations. But along with that comes this safeguard of the public trust, and that's written into state statute. The Legislative Assembly declares that service as a public official is a public trust, and that as one safeguard for that trust, the people require all public officials to comply with the applicable provisions of this chapter, 244. So there are some additional restrictions placed on you that aren't placed on private citizens by virtue of you holding a public official, and you're all individually accountable for complying with the law. So the public body that you serve can't provide you any indemnification or protection under statute. It's incumbent on you to understand these laws, and that's why we're here. The commission's really here, it's largely a complaint-driven process, but through this training, and we're always looking at ways to expand our training, we hope that people never have to come before us. This set of laws is tricky, but it just requires a little bit of forethought, and most people can avoid ever violating the law. A new definition, or rather a definition that changed recently with the last legislative session, is the definition of relatives, and so I've included it here to highlight those changes. Now, a relative means spouse, parent, step-parent, child, sibling, step-sibling, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law of the public official or candidate, or the parent, step-parent, child, sibling, step-sibling, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law of the spouse of the public official or candidate, in addition to three portions that were there before: person for whom the public official has a legal support obligation, alimony, child support, things of that nature; a person benefiting from a public official when benefits are from the public official's public employment, so anybody who relies on that income for benefits; and then a person who benefits a public official or candidate when benefits are from that person's employment. So the reverse is true as well. So now we get to talk about use of office restrictions, because again, there are these restrictions in place, things you can and can't do in your capacity as a public official, and it's important for you to familiarize yourself with these restrictions. This is sort of the cornerstone statute of government ethics law. So 244040 states, except as provided in subsection 2 of this section, a public official may not use or attempt to use their official position or office to obtain some financial gain or avoid a financial detriment, but for themselves, rather, a relative or member of household of the public official, any business with which they, a relative, or a member of their household is associated, if that financial gain or the avoidance of that financial detriment would not otherwise be available but for the public official holding the official position or office. So what does that mean? You can't use your position to obtain a gain or avoid a detriment that wouldn't be available to you, to your relatives, members of your household, or any business with which any of you are associated, because that opportunity came to you as a public official. So prohibited gains can be, some examples, obtaining a financial gain or benefit with a monetary value, or avoiding an expense. So if you get a discount for being a public official, depending on the discount, there may be restrictions to what you can and can't receive. If you use a state vehicle and you use that state vehicle for uses that are not strictly expressed in your official contract, or the agreement with the state motor pool, then you could be avoiding an expense that you would otherwise incur, and that could potentially be a violation of state ethics laws. They don't have to result in any cost for the public body. So an example, because I like to pick on libraries for some reason, if you're a volunteer at a library, and in your private life you own a business as a travel agent, if you use the computers at the library that are only available to the employees of the library to manage any aspects of your business, including correspondence, then you could potentially be violating state ethics laws. Now, if you use computers that were available to all members of the public under the same terms and conditions, likely you would avoid violating this law. But you can see that pretty easily that line starts to shift, and something that seems innocuous enough could actually be a violation. But there are exceptions. So there are some things you can have by virtue of holding an office. That's good, right? The first is any part of an official compensation package as determined by the public body that you serve. Pretty straightforward. But the official compensation package, there is additional guidance in administrative rules that explains exactly what that is. That has to be laid out in a formal process. It can't be sort of an ad hoc, this was sort of expected, without any clear establishment of that benefit for you as a public official holding that official position. Also excluded reimbursement of expenses when those expenses are approved of in advance. Gifts of not more than $50 in a calendar year from a source that has a legislative or administrative interest. Gifts are a big issue, and we'll go into them in further detail down the road, but this is one thing to keep in mind. Gifts of any value from a source that could not reasonably be known to have a legislative or administrative interest. Now this one's changed a little bit. So excluded from these prohibited gains are gifts of any value from a source that could not reasonably be known to have a legislative or administrative interest. In the past, that legislative or administrative interest was put on the public body that you serve. Now it's actually on you as an individual public official and the decisions, actions, and recommendations that you make, the authority that you have, which makes the analysis much more circumstantial, but also really allows you to receive gifts from more sources. Also excluded the receipt of any item which is excluded from the definition of gift in ORS 244, section 020.
This is a question that
Yeah.
the F, that exemption, is that the voter decider exemption? The voter or decider?
Are you asking me, like in the statute, that it talks about decision or vote?
Right, I'm just wondering if, like, how that is narrowed from an individual from the
Right.
So if you're
I think
like a
Russ will
school
go into
person-
that a little bit later when we start talking about gifts, but that's right. Legislative administrative interest, like he talked about in your authority, but it really comes down to your decision or vote that you may make in your official position.
Right.
So, and the commission itself really didn't kind of use the common definition of vote itself. Is, we really didn't tackle vote, but we did tackle decision. Because it really wasn't defined in the statute what decision meant. So that was attached to administrative rule. And I think Russell talked about that administrative rule. So it really comes down to your vote or your decision-making authority. So it doesn't have to be the ultimate decider. Like myself as being the executive director of the agency may have ultimate decision-making authority in how the funds are expended, but my employees have autonomy inside of their, like, in other words, we wouldn't want my investigators taking gifts from folks that they're investigating, because they're making decisions on how that investigation is going to go along. So.
Yeah, and we'll provide some additional examples of how this analysis of legislative or administrative interest comes into play. So we also know that you as public officials, especially volunteer public officials, wear many hats. You have private lives, private jobs, income-generating opportunities, but there are some guidelines for what you can do as a public official. So you must not use the position that you hold as a public official to create the opportunity for additional personal income. That seems pretty straightforward. You also need to ensure that there is a clear distinction between the use of personal resources and time for personal income-producing activity and the use of the public body's time and resources. So some examples. This is sort of our guidelines for private employment. Use no public time for your private income generating purposes. No public resources. Take no official action that could financially impact your private enterprise. That's a big one. We'll talk about conflicts of interest momentarily. Use no confidential information obtained through your position as a public official. And disclose all conflicts of interest. And we'll get into methods of disposal here in a moment. So there are, in addition to that list, some restrictions related specifically to public contracts that you may authorize as public officials. So a person who ceases to hold a position as a public official may not have a direct beneficial financial interest in a public contract for 2 years after their service as a public official, when one of the parties to the contract is the official's former public body, if the contract was authorized by the public official in their former capacity as a public official, or was authorized by a governing body, so board, committee, or council, that the former public official was a member of when the contract was authorized. Here again, the analysis gets very circumstance specific. So if you have questions, I ask that you hold those for now and contact us during the course of business hours, and we can answer those for you on a case-by-case basis. Let's talk a little bit about those conflicts of interest. There are two types. We'll start with actual conflict of interest. Because the definition of actual versus potential conflict hinges on the difference in statute between would and could. So an actual conflict of interest is any action, decision, or recommendation by a public official in their official capacity, the effect of which would be to the private pecuniary gain or detriment of the public official, a relative of the public official, or business with which either are associated. So in the case of an actual conflict, the financial effect of an action is certain. It'll have some effect one way or the other. And then that action would present an actual conflict. Now, a potential conflict of interest sounds almost identical. Any action, decision, or recommendation by a public official in their official capacity, the effect of which could be to the private pecuniary gain or detriment of the official relative or business of the official or relative. So, if the financial effect might happen but might not, then the situation would present only a potential conflict of interest to a public official. And the methods of disposal are different depending on which type of conflict you face. So you need to ask yourself, when you are making these decisions, actions, recommendations, votes, will the action, decision, or recommendation have a financial effect on myself, my relatives, or business with which either are associated? Then is the impact of the action, decision, or recommendation certain? Or is it direct or indirect? And finally, and this gets a little complicated, so we'll only touch on this, but does the official action, decision, or recommendation affect the public official to the same degree as a class of other individuals? So there is a class exception. If you're making a change to the public education system that might financially affect you, but it affects you to the same degree that affects the rest of the state, well, clearly, if you're all met with the same conflict, you don't have to declare. But the definition for a class, group, industry, occupation, is very circumstance specific. And so here again, we ask that you contact us if there's any question in your mind whether or not the presence of a class exists. We can help you make that decision. So what do you do if you're met with a conflict? Since you are officials on a board or commission, you must publicly announce potential conflicts of interest on each occasion before taking action. So publicly declare, state the nature of your conflict, that it's a potential conflict, that it happens because your brother is associated with a business that sells textbooks, etc. And that in this case, the impact is uncertain, but it might have a financial impact.
Using that example, what if it was a response to an open bidding process and his brother won the bid?
Well, if they won the bid and then it's an up or down vote on approval of the bid, then in that case, the impact of that decision would be certain. And so we would say that you would likely, in that case, be met with an actual conflict. And there, you must announce the actual conflict of interest, so you still have to state the nature of the conflict on each occasion that you're met with that conflict, but then refrain from participation in debate, discussion, or voting on the issue out of which the actual...
So the example you're using would be the only thing that was was brought before the commission that I was on, and not what my brother... In other words, if the bid was on laundry, then and the books would have been brought before this group here, so there's potential conflict of it, but it was open bid. You're saying no. But if it was laundry service and some other agency selected him or her as a brother or sister, then there'd be they wouldn't even have to announce it because it's not brought before this commission.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not making any actions, there has to be an action to have a conflict of interest. But if you're doing some type of official action, either selecting somebody to do laundry services, and you may have a relative, or you yourself may own a business that does laundry, you could announce that potential conflict. But if it came down to actually awarding the contract, if you were awarding that contract, and you were awarding to a business to which a relative was associated, you'd have an actual conflict. But if somebody else is making a decision, and they say all the laundry services for all the school districts is going to be this person, this company, they're just basically giving you that information. You don't have a conflict.
And you can see how one slight difference in the circumstances can change the analysis. And by virtue of that analysis, what actions you may need to take as a public official to handle those conflicts.
Now, I just want to say one thing real quick. On the potential conflict of interest, it's very important that you can continue to act after that announcement. In other words, you can debate the issue and you can vote on that. It just comes down to on a potential conflict of interest. It's only an actual conflict that you have to refrain from participation.
Well, what if you have a vested interest, though, out in another aid? Well, let's be real. My company's got the bid for state police cars right now.
Okay.
So I don't think we're going to be deciding on bid for state police cars here right now. But it was an open bid where everybody competed in the whole world. So there's no conflict then.
Right. Yeah, it would have to be a decision before you. So it starts with, there are three components. The first is an action, decision, or recommendation that you make in your official capacity, which causes a private pecuniary benefit or detriment, so it has some specific financial effect to yourself, your relatives, or a business with which you or your relatives are associated.
Did we answer your question, Mr. Whitnell? Did we answer your question for you?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. It was just an advertisement I wanted to get on the page. No, I wanted to get clear.
That would be abolished.
That might be a conflict. Yeah. That's all right.
That's a good point. But I did have my Nikes on, though. How's that?
So let's talk about the third area that I wanted to cover, and we'll only cover it sort of on the bare bones level because gifts are messy things. But as public officials, it's important for you to know. So we're going to talk a little bit about gifts. I can see.
How about gifts and lunches?
Ben already shaking his head.
Deep sigh.
So a gift is something of economic value given to a public official, a relative of the public official, or a member of the household of the public official, without payment or other consideration. So whether it's free or it's discounted, it's something that is given to you. And under specific conditions, you can accept gifts. But let's talk about the conditions under which you may be restricted from receiving gifts. So during a calendar year, a public official or a relative or member of the household of the public official may not solicit or receive, directly or indirectly, any gift or gifts with an aggregate value in excess of $50 from any single source that could reasonably be known to have a legislative or administrative interest. Now, again, we could go into a lot of scenarios. So I just want to put this information in front of you to provide you with some questions that you'll ask yourself in the future in decision making. We can't answer them all here. But what does that mean? In the context of gifts offered to or accepted by a public official, the public official must determine if the source of the offered gifts has a legislative or administrative interest in the decisions or votes that they make. So we talked a little bit about source. It's defined in administrative rule. The source of the gift is the person or entity that makes the ultimate and final payment of the gift's expense. So it places a burden on the public official to know the identity of the source and ensure that the aggregate value of the source does not exceed the limits imposed by 244025. And this we touched on earlier, and it's a big can of worms, but legislative or administrative interest is also defined. And it's an economic interest distinct from that of the general public in any matter subject to the decision or vote of the public official acting in their capacity as a public official. And this changed because it used to be any matter subject to the decision or vote of the public body or the public official served. So it actually restricted a lot of sources. Now it's more narrowly defined, and as a result requires more comprehensive analysis. But here we talk a bit about vote and decision. Currently, the definition of vote is the common meaning to vote as an elected member of a governing body, of a public body, or a member of a committee, commission, or board. Decision is much more narrowly defined. The Commission adopted a rule that an official makes a decision when the public official exercises the authority given to them to commit their public body to a particular course of action. Making a recommendation that is non-binding or giving advice in an advisory capacity does not constitute a decision. Along with the broad exception of gifts that don't come from a source with a legislative or administrative interest, there is, in statute, a long list, 16 items long, of exceptions to the definition of gift. And here are the 3 most common that would affect you. So we will not go into all 16. If you have questions about what they are, please, sometime after this training, feel free to contact our office. But these exceptions include the E exception, which is admission provided to or the cost of food or beverage consumed by a public official, member of the household, or staff of the public official when accompanying the public official at a reception, meal, or meeting held by an organization when the public official is representing a government agency. The F exception, reasonable food, lodging, and travel expenses when paid by, so in this case the source is important, government entity, Native American tribe, membership organization of which the public body is a member, or nonprofit organizations to participate in a convention, fact-finding mission or trip, or meeting where the public official is scheduled to participate, so speak or panel discussion or represent government. And then the H exception, which is similar, reasonable food, lodging, and travel expenses paid on behalf of the public official or a relative, member, household, or staff when representing the government agency on a trade promotion, fact-finding mission, negotiations, or economic development. Now, there is a whole division of administrative rules that is devoted pretty much entirely to gift analysis. So I can't begin to describe all of the aspects of this, but again, what we want to provide you with here at this time is some basis on which you can ask us questions in the future. If you have questions, please come to us. So if you're offered a gift, you must analyze the offer and decide if something of value can be accepted with or without restrictions. So that ends gifts. I wanted to just briefly touch on the complaint review process in case any of you are unfortunate enough to have a complaint filed against you. Any member of the public can file a complaint with the Ethics Commission. It has to be a signed complaint. It's not anonymous. The committee, or the Government Ethics Commission can also file a complaint on an own motion. So we can initiate our own complaints, although that's what, 25%, 20%, even less than that. If the complaint has merit, then it can enter the preliminary review phase. This is all statutorily defined. It's 135-day maximum time, although there are some allowances for extensions. That preliminary review phase is confidential, but it allows our investigators to establish whether there's a reasonable belief to initiate an investigation. The investigation phase may follow. It can last up to 180 days, again, with some leeway for extensions. And that usually ends in a settlement, but it can also go to a contested case hearing. Finally, some resources and information for you. This is what we do. In addition to training, which we do live and in person like this, we provide for free over the web. We provide both live training on the web in a webinar scenario, and then also we have some recorded trainings. We offer staff advice. So, and this does offer you some protection under statute. If you provide all of the circumstances in your situation prior to taking action, we can give you advice that if you follow, there's some protection for. And that advice gets upgraded to staff opinions or advisory opinions depending on sort of the need. It's a case-by-case basis. We don't issue a lot of advisory opinions, but those are much more thorough. They have statutory time limits, and they're adopted by the commission. So here's a telephone number. Commit that to memory. 503-378-5105. We're very reachable via email as well. Very good turnaround time, as some of you have already noted. We have a website which is going to undergo dramatic revisions later this year, if all goes to plan, but already offers you a lot of resources, including a guide for public officials, which is much more substantial than the handout we were able to include in your packet today. It's about 83 pages long, and it's very thorough. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions or comments?
I did. So for legislators, for example, if a lobbying, or somebody who's an organization or a lobbyist that file, if they have an expenditure, but that's only for the legislative branch. If you're a recipient of something that's, say, $45, a meal or something that's $45, who has a reporting obligation, or there is none if it's less than $50? Or if you're not a non-legislative.
Yeah, first of all, the public official, there is no reporting of gifts. But if a lobbyist actually provides some kind of expenditure on a legislative official, then there is a reporting requirement by the lobbyist to say that they have expended that.
That form seems very specific to the legislative branch. Would they be?
Well, the statutes are actually around not just the legislators, but it's also an executive official. So,
but like for us, for example, I mean, I don't know where would that ever be filed?
Well, if somebody was lobbying you folks and providing you with some type of benefit for their lobbying, like they provided lunch or dinner or something
Say
like that.
a textbook representative bought somebody a lunch. Is there a current form? I know all about the legislative process, having been involved in that, but is there something for non-legislative public bodies?
If a textbook distributor offered you folks lunch and you accepted that lunch, it was under $50, there is no reporting.
If it's above $50, it does need to be reported, but then from there the analysis is much more circumstance-based. Because some expenses need to be itemized by public official. It just depends on the value of that reimbursed expense. But the form, the quarterly expenditure report that's most commonly used for legislative officials does actually apply to executive officials.
And are we executive branch because we're been appointed by the governor?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And now there are public officials that do file a report once a year called a Statement of Economic Interest. You folks are not Statement of Economic Interest filers unless you are already in a position.
We were told we had to.
Well, you might check with your chair on that. There was a time when this committee was part of the governor's office. And inside the governor's office in statute, it talks about everybody other than essentially clerical who will file a Statement of Economic Interest. But now that you are actually on your own, you're not underneath in the governor's office, it has been determined that you are not SEI filers for this committee. You may have obligations that you are filers for some other public position out there, because there's about 6,000 of us that have to file.
State Board of Higher Ed, Higher Education Coordinating Commission, they're there's a long list in statute. And if you have questions about whether or not you're supposed to receive an SCI form, again, please contact our office because we can find that information for you.
It would be great to get,
Who's over in charge right now?
to get guidance on, for the members, because I know in the past we've had to, but
Right,
that's
last
not
year we did.
it's not a requirement.
Right, I believe when this was set up, there was some talk about voluntary filing, but it was, the statute's pretty specific on who has to file a statement of economic interest, and this particular body is not in there at this time.
And I'm going to volunteer to fill it out, so, anyone could volunteer.
And
but-
why don't you send me an email on that, because I'll add you to the list to make sure that there is one created for you, because unfortunately at this point, we are still in this mode of it's a paper filing, but in this biennium, we are there trying to fix that by having electronic reporting. So we essentially have to order you a statement of economic interest and then have it sent to you.
I think it would be
But-
helpful, Nancy, if you could
Get an interpretation.
get an
of the board.
interpretation
Yeah,
by the
absolutely.
board and then communicate to the board about whether. we
I had a
file or not.
conversation today with the governor's attorney, and they had informed me that they would not be having your.
But I'll get it in writing.
Yeah, it would be nice to have it in
Just to
writing.
make
I got an
it
nasty
feel
letter last year. so-
Yeah.
Very nice to have him, right?
The
Yeah.
legislature often has
Okay.
to play catch up and add agencies after they've created them.
Is it okay for Sam to buy me a gift? That's important.
But I'm not going to get him a 76 Dodge Dart like the one I saw you.
What's the one that you're driving?
Well,
But seriously though, is there any interplay between the commission and its members themselves?
The commission has come out with opinions on essentially colleagues kind of gifting each other, and then basically kind of came up in the legislature that we had said there's really no legislative administrative interest between legislators because there's no financial benefit in that in your decision making. But if you have a governing body here, and you may have an issue that you're at odds at, and if one person is basically kind of trying to talk to the other, and they buy lunch during that conversation, again, there's no economic benefit to you during that. But if you have specific questions, I think it was Russ was trying to say, if you have specific questions about being gifted something, just give our office a call. We'll ask you to put it in writing in an email, and then we'll provide you an email in return. That way you have something in writing. So Russ had talked a little bit about the protections inside the statutes for getting advice from the commission. And by you having something in writing, it affords you those protections. Should somebody complain about it, and as I saw today, you folks have your fans out there that are watching your every move, and that's pretty much clear with every public body out there. There's always people watching them. So, if you have a question about any of this, declaring conflicts of interest, gifts, or use of office, please contact us. We'll get back to you right away.
And was Leonie the person you spoke to?
I did speak with Leonie today.
Okay,
Yes.
that's what I'll talk to you.
Yeah, she's actually the commission's policy advisor with the governor's office.
Okay,
So
great.
it makes it convenient for us having this legal counsel be that policy advisor.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Informative. Anything else for the good of the order?
Just everybody, timelines of when the next other meetings are in the left of your packet, just so you have them.
Is that new?
No, I think it's new. I don't think there's new dates on it, but are there any
It
new
was
dates?
sent with the packet last week. It was sent with the packet last week, so it hasn't changed since.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks. This meeting is adjourned.